Chapter 1. 1,000 Arrows Through the Heart. The Great Eldoria Dynasty, outskirts of the capital. At this moment, Eleanor Bennet, lady of the Ashford estate, was staring furiously at the handsome man standing opposite her. That man, none other than her husband of 5 years, was now embracing the woman she once loved most, her younger sister, Clara Bennet. They coldly watched as Eleanor Bennet was surrounded by countless layers of arrows.
"Why? David, I've been nothing but sincere to you. Why would you treat me like this?"
Eleanor Bennet's voice began to tremble.
"Why? Eleanor Bennet, let me tell you. I never loved you. Who do you think you are? If it weren't for your family's influence, do you think I would have married a country bumpkin like you?"
David Walker sneered disdainfully at her, his gaze filled with disgust, as if even looking at her longer would make him sick. There was no trace of the tenderness and affection he once showed her.
"No. You told me you loved me. I helped you defeat your elder brother so you could become the Marquis of Dynasty. Was that still not enough for you? Why? Why would you treat me this way? Why? Blame your own stupidity. Despite having the general's residence as your maternal family, you still ended up like this. Who else is there to blame? Huh? Your grandfather and uncle were too foolish to support Duke Edward. They deserved their downfall. What did you just say?"
Eleanor Bennet's eyes widened in disbelief as she stared at David Walker.
You killed my grandfather?"
David Walker didn't bother to explain further, and instead turned to look tenderly at Clara Bennet in his arms.
"Clara, do you see? Once she's dead, you'll be the legitimate wife of the Marquis of Dynasty. No one will dare to bully you anymore. Thank you, David. You're so kind to me,"
Clara Bennet replied in a soft, delicate voice that filled David Walker with joy.
"You? Clara Bennet, what did I ever do to wrong you? Why would you help him harm me like this? We're sisters by blood."
Eleanor Bennet couldn't understand. Though Clara wasn't her full-blooded sister, she had always treated her well, even going against their grandmother for her. But why? Why would Clara help David Walker harm her, and even harm her maternal family? Clara Bennet glanced at her, seemingly a bit reluctant.
"David, let me speak with my sister for a moment. After all, she's still my sister. Even if she didn't treat me well before, I can't completely disregard the bond we share."
Hearing this, Eleanor Bennet's expression immediately changed. What did that mean? As she looked at David Walker's affectionate gaze toward Clara, something seemed to explode in her mind. "So that's how it is? I always thought I was clever and resourceful, especially in political matters, helping David Walker countless times. Yet, in the end, I lost in this battle of the inner court?" Thinking back, Clara had always appeared docile and weak in front of her. Even when David Walker drunkenly violated her, she had only silently shed tears. Now, looking back, it was all part of her plan. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but laugh bitterly, tears streaming down her face. How foolish. I let this sweet little sister deceive me for so many years. Thinking back to shortly after I got married, she was, coincidentally, violated by David Walker. His excuse at the time was that he was drunk and mistook her for me. How laughable that I believed it. Eleanor Bennet's laughter grew more bitter, her tears flowing even more. At this moment, Clara Bennet and 2 guards approached her.
"Sister, don't blame me for being ruthless. Who told you to be the legitimate daughter while I am just the illegitimate one? Even after my mother became the second wife, I was already the Marquis's concubine. If you're still alive, I'll always be just a concubine, and my son will always be illegitimate. Tell me, how could I ever feel at ease? So, all of this was planned from the beginning? You just wanted the title of the legitimate wife? Fine, take it. But why did you have to drag my maternal family into this?" "Huh?" Eleanor Bennet remember this well. That was your maternal family, not mine. My mother's surname is Chambers, not Peterson.
Eleanor Bennet's heart suddenly turned cold. Indeed, her mother bore the surname Peterson, while Clara Bennet's mother was a Chambers. How foolish she had been. She thought they were the closest of sisters in the world. But it turned out to be nothing more than a trap aimed at her life, her wealth, and even harming her loved ones.
Rest assured, all the assets under your name now belong to my husband. With this wealth, tell me, won't his path to power be smoother?
Clara Bennet sneered, her eyes now openly filled with arrogance and pride. Looking at Clara Bennet standing before her, Eleanor Bennet finally understood. She had never truly known this younger sister of hers.
Eleanor Bennet, since you're about to die, let me reveal
another secret to you.
Clara Bennet lowered her voice.
Do you know how your mother died? It was my mother who poisoned her slowly, causing her to weaken over time. Oh, and your adorable little brother. Do you know how he ended up falling into the lotus pond?
You? Eleanor Bennet glared, wishing she could devour Clara Bennet alive.
You're insane. He was your brother too.
Clara Bennet curled her lips disdainfully.
Eleanor Bennet, you're unbelievably naive. If your little brother hadn't died, how could mine inherit your father's estate? If your mother hadn't died, how could my mother have become the second wife? They were obstacles in our way. They only had themselves to blame. Since you were so devoted to them, why don't you join them in the afterlife?
As if remembering something, Clara Bennet smiled sweetly.
Oh, by the way, do you think my family could have achieved all this without grandmother's scheming?
With those words, Clara Bennet didn't even spare Eleanor another glance. She turned toward David Walker, smiling shyly as she leaned gently against his chest. The words Clara had spoken earlier left Eleanor Bennet frozen in place. The arrow pierced her chest, yet she felt no pain. As the rain of arrows descended, Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on Clara Bennet. 1,000 arrows through the heart. Eleanor Bennet's body staggered before finally collapsing to the ground, filled with resentment. Her beautiful eyes remained wide open, staring at the gloomy sky above. Chapter 2, 10 Years of Torment. Too late. It was all too late. Something began to bloom slowly before Eleanor Bennet's eyes, like a white peony, growing larger, thinner, and fainter with each passing moment. Through the thin veil of white mist, she seemed to see her mother curled up in pain, her little brother being pushed into the lotus pond, her grandfather, her uncle, all of them separated from their heads, blood everywhere. Hate? How could she not hate? But at this moment, even breathing was a struggle for Eleanor Bennet. She could even feel her pupils dilating. What could someone on the brink of death like her possibly do? A bitter, self-mocking smile appeared on her lips.
Mother, little brother, grandfather, uncle, I'm sorry. I mistook a wolf in sheep's clothing for a pearl and caused the death of our entire family. If there's a next life, I swear I won't blindly trust such a monster again.
The vision before Eleanor Bennet gradually faded, and her consciousness began to blur. Even as David Walker and Clara Bennet approached, her eyes remained wide open, as if she had died with unresolved grievances. Clara Bennet seemed startled. Ah! Feeling the trembling body in his arms, David Walker glanced at the corpse on the ground with even more disdain.
Humph! No one liked her when she was alive, and now that she's dead, she still wants to cause trouble for me. Someone, throw the body into the river to feed the fish. Yes, Marquis.
No one could see her, but a translucent Eleanor Bennet stood beside the corpse of her own body. She watched helplessly as her lifeless form was thrown into the river, drifting along with the current. Now, she felt no pain anymore. It wasn't that she was heartless. Rather, her suffering had reached its peak, no longer numbness, but seething hatred.
Watching David Walker and Clara Bennett so intimately entwined, Eleanor finally understood the depth of shamelessness, the true meaning of treachery. Eleanor Bennett's soul lingered in the mortal realm. Yet her face no longer bore sorrow or rage. Everything now was out of her reach. She could only watch, powerless. For she was now a ghost, a wandering spirit. She witnessed David Walker wielding immense power for 10 years, rising from Marquis of Dingyuan to Duke of Dingyuan. She watched Clara Bennett transform from a mere Marchioness to the Duchess of the highest rank. She saw their son grow day by day. She also saw William Bennett, Clara Bennett's younger brother, inherit the Bennett family estate, his career flourishing as if blessed by fortune. And all of this, everything, should have belonged to her younger brother. But now? In the end, it was all part of a conspiracy, a cruel joke. What about her kind-hearted father? Murdered by his own child, surely he must be filled with resentment too. Not only that, but it wasn't until her death that she realized the reason she couldn't bear a child even after 5 years of marriage. It was all because of that wretched woman, Susan Chambers. That vile woman had secretly poisoned her with infertility drugs since she was only 15. Such a cruel and wicked woman deserved nothing but death. How foolish Eleanor had been to treat her as a real mother after her own mother's passing, only to find out that everything had been meticulously plotted against by that mother-daughter duo. If not for this, why would she have always felt guilty toward David Walker? Why, when alive, did she feel inferior? In Clara Bennett's presence, Eleanor Bennett no longer felt pain. Knowing she had been so thoroughly manipulated by Susan Chambers, she could only let out a bitter laugh. It was her own blindness that led to this. Who else could she blame? She had treated her mother's killer as her own mother. She had regarded the cruel woman who stole her husband as her own sister. She had been foolish. She had been naive. She had deserved her fate. But what crime had her maternal family committed? And yet, they became mere stepping stones for Duke Edward and David Walker. All that remained in Eleanor Bennett was hatred, pure hatred. 10 years had passed. A full decade. Her death was one thing. Not even being given a proper burial was another. But to have her spirit barred from entering Blackwood Manor, forced to watch those adulterers live in comfort and luxury, what could be more agonizing than this? At this moment, if anyone appeared before her and offered to help her seek revenge, she would willingly let her soul be destroyed, just to avenge her family and mother's death. But how could that happen? She was a ghost. Her words could not be heard by anyone. Who would ever be willing to help her? Once again, she drifted back to her mother's grave, now desolate and overgrown with weeds. Even though she longed to restore her mother's resting place, she was powerless to do so. She reached out, her hand passing through her mother's gravestone. Eleanor Bennett choked with grief, wanting to cry, but as a ghost, she had no tears to shed. This torment had plagued her for 10 long years. She personally witnessed the corpse of her grandfather and others, personally saw her father being killed by William Bennett and Susan Chambers, personally watched as each family member and friend fell one by one at the hands of those adulterous villains. Yet, she could do nothing. What could be more painful than this? What could torment her more than helplessly watching the corpses of her loved ones exposed in the wilderness? What could be more powerless than seeing her father drink poisoned wine while being unable to stop it? As she watched her loved ones and friends fall before her eyes, witnessing those horrific scenes while powerless, Eleanor Bennett's heart was left with nothing but hatred. Clara Bennett, David Walker, you heartless monsters. If there truly is another life, I swear I will make you wish for death. If I cannot personally destroy your bright futures, if I cannot personally ruin your beautiful dreams, then I am no longer Eleanor Bennett. Eleanor Bennett stared intently at her mother's gravestone, the engraved surname on it already faded. Clara Bennett, William Bennett, Susan Chambers. Just you wait. If in this life I cannot personally kill you, cannot even turn into a vengeful ghost to haunt you, then you better be prepared. This hatred, I will carry it for all eternity. Even if I step onto the bridge of forgetfulness, I will never drink the Mingpa soup. The pain I endure today, I will ensure you experience it 100-fold.
Mother, you always taught me to live with kindness. I've spent my life doing good deeds, even helping that ungrateful wolf harm his own brother without using any cruel schemes. Why must I suffer such a cruel fate? Grandmother spent her life chanting prayers and eating vegetarian meals, and what did she get in the end? Mother, I understand now. Treating good people kindly is righteous and noble. But treating evil people kindly is no different than aiding their wickedness and inviting suffering upon oneself. Mother, I swear if there is a next life, I will be a wicked woman, never showing mercy. Even if it means descending into the 18 levels of hell, I will be more ruthless than those vile creatures.
Eleanor Bennet no longer had tears to shed, but her eyes still burned. Suddenly, she saw her mother's gravestone tremble, and then she lost consciousness. Before blacking out, she thought, could it be that I am going to the underworld? Have the ghost messengers finally come to take me? Chapter 3. Returning to 10 years old. Pain. Why does it feel like a stabbing pain? The sharp pain in Eleanor Bennet's arm shot straight to her brain.
Madam, the young lady has woken up.
A tender voice rang out, and Eleanor Bennet slowly opened her eyes.
Eleanor, you've finally woken up. Let me see. Is there anywhere else that feels uncomfortable?
Eleanor Bennet froze. The gentle and beautiful woman before her, wasn't that her mother? Or was she dreaming? No, that couldn't be. Eleanor Bennet shook her head. She had died. How could a ghost dream? Perhaps she shook her head too hard, as Eleanor Bennet felt dizzy and lightheaded.
You silly child, you just woke up. Don't move too much.
Amelia Peterson spoke softly while quickly giving orders.
Go fetch the doctor, and have someone inform the master that the eldest young lady has woken up. Yes, madam.
Hearing Helen's voice beside her, Eleanor Bennet finally dared to believe she was alive. Looking down at her arm, she remembered that when she was 10 years old, she had climbed a tree to imitate her younger brother, only to fall and break her arm.
Mother!
Eleanor Bennet's voice was soft but filled with emotion.
Child, you're finally awake. You scared me to death.
Amelia Peterson's eyes were red as she dabbed at the corners with a handkerchief. Eleanor Bennet tried to sit up, smiling as she said,
Don't cry, Mother. See? I'm fine. You silly girl. Of all things, you had to learn climbing trees. What were you thinking?
Amelia Peterson scolded, her voice a mix of anger and worry. Eleanor Bennet knew her mother's words came from love. Before she could respond, the sound of the curtain rustling caught her attention. It was her younger brother, Henry Bennet, entering the room.
Sister, are you feeling better?
Looking at her brother's tender face, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel emotional. In her past life, her younger brother was the first family member she lost. His death had devastated their mother, who fell into prolonged grief and illness, crying day and night. Eventually, her mother lost favor in the household, paving the way for Susan Chambers. That woman had driven a wedge between her parents, causing her mother to die without even seeing her father one last time. Of course, Eleanor only learned these things after her death, when her wandering spirit lingered in the mortal world. While Susan Chambers had played a role in the tragedy, the root cause was still her brother's death. Now, after so many years, seeing her brother alive and well again, Eleanor's first thought was to protect him from that fatal disaster. Thinking carefully, wasn't it supposed to happen this very year?
Dear brother, I'm fine now. I'm sorry to have worried you. You're still defending him. If it weren't for this little rascal urging you to climb trees, How would you have gotten hurt?
Amelia Peterson said indignantly. Eleanor Bennet smiled and gestured for Henry Bennet to come closer.
Brother, have you been studying diligently these past few days?
Henry Bennet nodded obediently. Since childhood, he had been very close to his sister, likely because they were only 2 years apart and always had much to talk about.
Sister, it's all my fault. Once you recover, I'll make you a flute.
Eleanor Bennet's heart warmed. The flute was simply made from budding tree branches, not too difficult to craft, but making one that produced clear and melodious sounds required some skill.
All right, I'll be waiting. Eleanor's awake?
A deep voice sounded, and Eleanor Bennet's heart tightened. In her past life, she had witnessed her father die at the hands of William Bennet. That poisoned wine had caused her father excruciating stomach pain for half an hour before he finally succumbed, showing symptoms like tuberculosis. Compared to her mother and others, her father had suffered the most.
Father, it's my fault for being unfilial and making you worry.
Having opened her eyes today to see 3 family members she had lost, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. Seeing her father healthy now, tears streamed down her face.
Stop crying now. Look at you, Eleanor, so grown up yet still crying like a child.
George Bennet teased her. Eleanor Bennet laughed through her tears.
Father, you're mean. Always teasing me. All right. I'm mean, and only your mother is good. Is that better?
Seeing his beloved daughter laugh, George Bennet smiled as well. He sat down on a stool by her bed, studying her closely before saying,
Good thing you didn't hurt your head. If you had, where would I find another clever daughter like you?
Amelia Peterson couldn't help but chide him.
My lord, you're spoiling her too much. Be careful, or you'll ruin them. What nonsense! If I don't spoil my own children, who will?
George Bennet replied. Then, noticing his son timidly hiding behind his wife, he put on a stern face.
Henry, come here.
Hearing his father's call, Henry Bennet trembled, knowing he couldn't avoid punishment. He looked to Eleanor Bennet for help, but seeing her shake her head with a playful glint in her eyes, he felt reassured. He bravely stepped forward.
Father, I know I was wrong. I won't lead sister into dangerous games again.
George Bennet's smile from earlier disappeared as he addressed his son sternly.
It's good that you know your mistake. You are the legitimate son of this household, and your sister is the legitimate daughter. You must learn to respect her and not act recklessly as you did this time. Yes, father,
Henry replied earnestly.
Have you finished all of today's assignments? Yes, father, I have completed them all. Very well, follow me to the study. I will check your work. Yes, father.
Though Henry Bennet was mischievous, he couldn't help but feel a bit intimidated by his strict father. Bowing his head, he followed behind him. As he reached the door, he turned back to stick his tongue out at Eleanor Bennet, causing her to burst into laughter. How wonderful it was to have family by your side. What use were riches and glory, if not for the peace and safety of loved ones? Only when everyone was safe and sound could life be truly fulfilling. Eleanor Bennet tightly held her mother's hand, silently making a vow in her heart. Heaven had given her a second chance at life, and in this lifetime, she would protect her family at all costs, even if it meant killing anyone who threatened them. As long as her family was safe, she would face hell itself without fear. Chapter 4. The Aunt Arrives.
Madam, First Miss, Mrs. Chambers, and Second Miss have arrived,
reported Linda Young, Eleanor Bennet's trusted maid. The moment Eleanor saw her, her gaze sharpened. In her past life, she had foolishly trusted Clara Bennet and dismissed Linda Young from the household. As a result, Linda had been forced to marry into a declining family. Even after her mother passed away, Linda was the only one who regularly visited her grave. Thinking back, Eleanor felt utterly foolish for her previous actions.
Let them in. Yes, madam.
Though Linda noticed something unusual in Eleanor's expression, she dismissed it, assuming her mistress was still recovering from her recent illness. At that moment, Eleanor recalled that Susan Chambers was actually her grandmother's niece. Susan had always harbored resentment toward Eleanor's mother due to her noble background and the Bennett family's reliance on the Peterson family. However, she rarely caused trouble for Eleanor's mother. That changed when Eleanor's grandmother took advantage of her mother's visit to her parental home and brought Susan into the household as a concubine. By the time her mother returned, Susan and Eleanor's father were already married. Since Susan was her grandmother's blood relative, Eleanor's mother chose to endure the humiliation and accept her as a concubine. However, because the marriage had taken place before an official ceremony, Eleanor's mother refused to grant Susan the title of honored concubine, only allowing her the status of a regular concubine. This decision deeply offended Eleanor's grandmother, who felt her daughter-in-law had disgraced her and disrespected the Chambers family. From then on, she constantly criticized and belittled Eleanor's mother, even in front of her father. Fortunately, Eleanor's parents shared a deep bond, and her father never distanced himself from her mother. Nevertheless, he still had a son and daughter with Susan Chambers. While lost in thought, Eleanor noticed Linda lifting the curtain as Susan Chambers and Clara Bennett entered the room one after the other. Susan Chambers was dressed today in a light green outfit, which gave her a slightly more delicate appearance. However, her heavily applied makeup betrayed her effort to appear refined. Paired with several gold accessories adorning her head, her overall look was garish and overdone. Eleanor couldn't help but suppress a laugh, lowering her head. Susan Chambers truly lacked any sense of taste. How ridiculous she looked. In her past life, Eleanor had failed to see through this woman's pretensions. A rustic concubine like her could never have risen to her position without the backing of the old matron.
"Greetings, madam,"
Susan Chambers said with a bow.
"Greetings to my honored mother."
Clara Bennett followed suit.
"Dispense with formalities. Eleanor has just woken up. It's not convenient for others to disturb her. If there's nothing urgent, you may leave. Your thoughtfulness is appreciated."
Amelia Peterson's tone was calm, clearly showing her dislike for this mother-daughter pair. Mrs. Chambers, however, acted as if she didn't notice the displeasure in the lady's words. Instead, she stepped forward and asked warmly,
"Does the eldest miss still have a headache? Shall I personally prepare some calming soup for her?"
A hint of disgust flashed in Amelia Peterson's eyes as she waved her hand dismissively.
"No need. You may leave."
Mrs. Chambers respectfully curtsied before retreating. This scene made Eleanor Bennett recall how, not long ago, her mother's health had declined, prompting the old matriarch to assign Mrs. Chambers to assist in managing the household. Assist was putting it lightly. It was more like seizing power. Humph. Thinking back to her previous life, her head injury had healed and relapsed repeatedly. Eventually, the old matriarch outright ordered her mother to focus solely on caring for her, while handing over all household management to Mrs. Chambers. Reflecting on it now, it was clear the old matriarch had planned everything from the start.
"Mother, what was Mrs. Chambers implying just now? Why did she want to prepare soup for me? Has the kitchen steward been replaced?"
Eleanor Bennett's seemingly innocent question made Amelia Peterson realize something more serious. She froze for a moment before smiling.
"It's
nothing. The same steward remains. If you want anything, just let her know to prepare it for you." "Yes, thank you, Mother." "Mother, I've already woken up and I'm fine now. You should go rest. Later, after Father finishes testing Henry on his studies, he'll surely visit Silkwood Court. Don't keep him waiting."
Amelia Peterson was taken aback. How had her daughter become so sensible after this fall? It was true that her husband had such a habit. Every day, after testing Henry, he would visit Silkwood Court to chat with her and sometimes ask her to play the zither for him.
Eleanor, Mother is just worried about you. What is there to worry about, Mother? I have Linda Young and Nani Victoria taking care of me here. Please don't worry. Besides, the physician already said I'm fine, didn't he? You have many responsibilities. Don't let my situation delay you and risk being reprimanded by the old matriarch.
Eleanor Bennett's words left Amelia Peterson even more astonished. Though this daughter was her own flesh and blood, she had always been closer to the old matriarch. Perhaps because she was the legitimate daughter, she had been sent to the old matriarch to be raised from birth. Later, when Amelia became pregnant with Henry Bennett, she naturally had even less time to care for Eleanor, leading to a growing emotional distance between them. Over the years, Amelia had constantly regretted leaving her daughter to be raised by the old matriarch, which had caused their mother-daughter bond to weaken. Eleanor Bennett, of course, understood Amelia Peterson's doubts. She let out a bitter laugh.
Mother, I was ignorant before. Please rest assured, I won't let you down again.
Hearing this, Amelia Peterson, though still filled with questions, decided not to dwell on them for now. She embraced Eleanor tightly, tears streaming down her face.
My daughter? My good girl. Wonderful. You've finally seen reason. I can rest assured now.
Eleanor Bennett knew that the
reason
her mother referred to was her newfound loyalty to her. That was why Amelia was so emotional. After seeing her mother off, Eleanor began pondering her past life. Why had her headaches fluctuated between better and worse, lingering for nearly 2 months? Thinking it over, the biggest issue must have been with those medicinal decoctions and supplements.
Linda Young, come here. I have something for you to do.
Eleanor called her over, whispered a few words, and Linda nodded before leaving. Soon, the medicine was brought in.
Nani Victoria will stay here to attend to me. The rest of you may leave. Yes, Mississippi. Nani Victoria, pour this bowl of medicine into the pot of camellias over there.
Once everyone had left, Eleanor immediately gave the order. Nani Victoria was startled.
Miss, what are you doing? Your head injury is still fresh. Why aren't you drinking the medicine?
Chapter 5. Reunion with the half-sibling.
Shoo. Nani Victoria, keep your voice down.
Eleanor Bennett gestured for silence. Then, with a mysterious tone, she said,
Didn't you hear Mrs. Chambers mentioning she wants to prepare sedative soup for me?
Just one sentence was enough to make Nani Victoria alert. She quickly glanced outside before asking,
Miss, are you worried about something? One must not harm others, but it's prudent to be wary. Nani Victoria, you were sent by my mother, and are also my wet nurse, so I naturally trust you. This moonlit terrace, I fear, already has Mrs. Chambers' spies planted.
Nani Victoria, being experienced and wise, immediately grasped Eleanor Bennett's implication and cautiously inquired,
Miss, do you mean? Not in a rush. I've instructed Linda Young to take the residue of the medicine from each time to the doctor outside for examination. Mrs. Chambers is meticulous. She wouldn't poison every time. But I can't just sit idle and wait, can I? Who knows when she might or might not poison? But miss, if you avoid taking medicine because of this, that's not a solution either.
Nani Victoria said anxiously. Unexpectedly, Eleanor Bennett smirked mischievously.
Don't worry, Nani. Linda Young isn't just taking the medicine residue for examination. She's also looking for a few remedies for me. One for external use, and one in pill form, convenient in every way. Miss, you are truly wise.
Nani Victoria smiled with relief upon hearing this. With everything settled, Eleanor Bennett began pondering about her life in this reincarnation, how to live, how to protect her younger brother from misfortune, how to reconcile her parents, how to ensure her father enjoys his old age in peace, and how to shield her maternal family from impending calamity. At 10 years old, Though still young, she was no longer a child. It was time to understand the world. She couldn't fathom why, in her past life, she had been so foolish, close to the old matriarch yet distant from her own mother. Letting out a soft sigh, she resolved that in this life, no matter what, she wouldn't let
Mrs. Chambers have her way, nor would she allow the old matriarch to seize her mother's control over the Peterson family. It must be known that while the Bennet family was considered a prestigious household, it still paled in comparison to her maternal family. The old matriarch and Mrs. Chambers had exploited the fact that her mother married beneath her status, using her noble background to make her father resentful and insecure. Well then, she could use this to her advantage too. Thinking of this, Eleanor Bennet's beautiful eyes narrowed slightly. A noble background didn't just signify power and status. For a woman, it was even more about grace, demeanor, and elegance. These were qualities Mrs. Chambers could never match. With her plan firmly in mind, Eleanor Bennet no longer intended to curry favor with the old matriarch. She had a mother of noble birth, was the only legitimate daughter of the Bennet residence, and enjoyed the love of her grandfather and uncles. No matter what, there was no need to bow and scrape before the scheming old matriarch. Of course, she knew how to handle appearances. For instance, morning and evening greetings were a formality she wouldn't neglect. But flattering and fawning? In this life, she vowed never to do that in front of the old matriarch again. The next day, Eleanor Bennet woke up, had breakfast and her medicine, and as usual, instructed Nanny Victoria to dispose of the medicine bowl. She then headed to Silkwood Court, first to pay respects to her mother, and then to accompany her to the grand hall where the old matriarch resided. As soon as they entered the courtyard, lively laughter could be heard. It wasn't hard to recognize the voices of Mrs. Chambers and Clara Bennet. At this time, her father hadn't yet returned from court, and her younger brother had already gone to clan school. As for William Bennet, her younger half-brother, he was probably being pampered in the old matriarch's lap right now. William Bennet is 6 years old this year, and will have to move to the outer residence next year. In fact, if stricter, now would already be the time. Father was very strict in educating Henry Bennet, sending him to the outer residence at the age of 5 to personally teach him, showing how much he valued this legitimate son. As for William Bennet, it's evident that father doesn't have high expectations of him. After all, he is still his biological son, so being entirely indifferent wouldn't be acceptable. Yet to this day, father has never mentioned enlightening his mind, which shows he harbors some dislike for him. How pitiful that in my past life, I failed to realize this and thought father deeply loved him, refraining from sending him to martial school out of concern. Now, it seems that wasn't the case at all. Having gone through the ups and downs of life, Eleanor Bennet now truly sees clearly that the one father cherishes most is Henry Bennet, her younger brother. It's a pity that as a child, she didn't understand this and mistakenly thought father favored William Bennet, gradually distancing herself from him. Thinking back now, she feels she was so foolish then. Eleanor Bennet took a deep breath, thinking of her good younger sister, and the corners of her lips lifted slightly.
"Mother, let's go in."
At this moment, Amelia Peterson also frowned slightly. Her daughter had just been injured, yet here she was, appearing cheerful as if nothing had happened. Usually, the old madam seemed to care deeply for her daughter, and Eleanor always showed respect for the old lady, but now it seemed to leave a chill in one's heart.
"Greetings, mother." "Greetings, grandmother."
Susan Chambers and Clara Bennet quickly stood up upon seeing Amelia Peterson enter. After the two greeted her, they also returned the courtesy to Amelia Peterson and Eleanor Bennet. Eleanor glanced at William Bennet, who was leaning against the old madam on the bed, and her eyes darkened slightly.
"Second brother, why haven't you stood up yet? Have you forgotten the rules?"
As soon as she finished speaking, the old madam's expression changed, and even Amelia Peterson's face turned pale. The old madam adored this grandson more than her own son. Moreover, William Bennet rarely performed formal greetings in her presence. Eleanor's remark today made Amelia Peterson quite uneasy.
"Eleanor, your second brother is still young. Some rules can wait until he's older to learn."
Hearing the slightly stiff tone of the old madam, Eleanor Bennet smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on William Bennet standing before her.
"Grandmother, I may have overstepped today. Second brother is a descendant of the Bennet family, and is destined to achieve great things in the future. William, don't you agree?"
A single call of "William" stirred a strange feeling within William Bennet's heart. At just 6 years old, the young boy naturally didn't understand the power struggles within the household. He only knew that his grandmother adored him, which is why he clung to her. As for this eldest sister, she had always treated him with a detached attitude, not too warm, not too cold. Yet today, even though she was clearly scolding him, why did it feel so oddly comforting? Raising his eyes to look into his elder sisters, why were they so beautiful? They sparkled more brilliantly than the sapphire on his grandmother's forehead. He could even see his own reflection in them. What William Bennet said next caused Mrs. Chambers' face to pale instantly. Chapter 6. Teaching You Proper Etiquette.
"Elder sister is absolutely right. In the future, I will be someone who achieves great things, so naturally, I cannot neglect proper manners and etiquette."
After saying this, William Bennet got out of bed, and a maid promptly stepped forward to help him with his shoes and socks. Only then did he approach Amelia Peterson and bow respectfully.
"I greet my mother."
Amelia Peterson was momentarily stunned. In the past, just a few harsh words from her would cause this second son to throw a tantrum in front of the old matriarch. What was happening today? How could just a few words from Eleanor suddenly change his demeanor? The old matriarch, seeing her beloved grandson behaving so sensibly, said nothing. After all, as a concubine-born son, greeting his legitimate mother was only proper. However, when she glanced over, Mrs. Chambers' face was as white as a sheet of paper. Though the old matriarch felt a pang of reluctance, she couldn't allow others to accuse her grandson of lacking manners, of failing to bow to his legitimate mother. So, she turned her face away, pretending not to notice Mrs. Chambers' unpleasant expression. Unexpectedly, after bowing to Amelia Peterson, William Bennet turned to Eleanor Bennet and respectfully bowed again.
"I greet my elder sister."
William Bennet's actions left Clara Bennet slightly annoyed. Why should her younger brother bow to the child of that woman? Mrs. Chambers' face grew even more unsightly. Eleanor Bennet smiled, her eyes slightly squinting with a warm glow.
"Little brother, this clasped hand salute is a traditional etiquette of our dynasty. Both hands clasped, raised high, with a slight bow, showing respect to the other person. William's movements were very good, but there was one mistake. Would you like your elder sister to teach you?"
As soon as these words left her mouth, the old madam, who had been pretending to sip tea, suddenly paused, gently placing the teacup down with a serious expression as she looked at Eleanor Bennet. This girl had never been particularly close to William Bennet, so why was she acting so unusually today? William Bennet blinked, a little confused, and said,
"I humbly ask elder sister for guidance."
Eleanor Bennet nodded slightly, looking quite pleased with the boy's attitude.
"The clasped hand salute varies depending on the occasion. For men, the right hand is clenched into a fist, covered by the left hand, called the auspicious salute, commonly used during festive occasions. The reverse is the mourning salute, used during funerals. For women, it's the opposite, left hand clenched, covered by the right hand for the auspicious salute. Do you remember, William?"
Mrs. Chambers' face grew even darker. A moment ago, she had been too angry to notice that William Bennet had performed the salute incorrectly. Now that Eleanor Bennet had caught this mistake, it would not be easy to dismiss. The old madam squinted, a sharp glint flashing in her eyes, directed straight at Amelia Peterson. Amelia Peterson, still sitting upright on her chair, naturally felt the old madam's gaze. However, she believed her daughter had done an excellent job. A 6-year-old boy who didn't even know the most basic etiquette. What a laughable embarrassment. Hearing Eleanor's explanation, William Bennet's small face flushed red with embarrassment. He looked up at Eleanor Bennet and saw her warmly smiling at him, which made him feel unexpectedly reassured. This elder sister, who had never been close to him, was someone he often saw playing with his older brother or reading books together. At those times, he had often thought how wonderful it would be if she were his sister. It wasn't surprising that William Bennet thought this way. Eleanor Bennet had inherited Amelia Peterson's beauty. Though still young, she already exuded a hint of grace. Coupled with her meticulous upbringing, her speech and manners were entirely different from Clara Bennet's. She always gave off a warm, sunny aura, making people naturally want to approach her. Seeing her every day only made William want to be closer to her. Today, being gently spoken to by Eleanor Bennet, William almost thought he was dreaming. If it weren't for the many people present, he might have leaped with joy. The room was so silent that even the drop of a pin could be heard, and the atmosphere was unbearably stifling. Even Amelia Peterson felt as though she were sitting on pins and needles. Yet Eleanor Bennet's face maintained its gentle, warm, and soft smile. William Bennet blushed, then suddenly raised his head to look at Amelia Peterson. He bowed to her and said,
"I greet my esteemed mother."
Amelia Peterson was momentarily stunned before forcing a smile.
"Good child, no need for formalities. You're still young. You can learn these rules gradually over time." "Yes, thank you, esteemed mother."
After speaking, William Bennet turned to Eleanor Bennet, looking up at her with a flattering expression.
"Elder sister, did I do it correctly this time?"
Eleanor Bennet reached out her right hand to gently pat his head, smiling.
"William is indeed clever. I only had to explain once, and you remembered perfectly. That makes me very happy." "Really? Is William truly that intelligent?"
The voice carried a hint of excitement and joy. Eleanor Bennet nodded at him, then turned to look at the elderly lady lying on the bed and said,
"Grandmother, while the Bennet family may not be a grand aristocratic lineage, we are a family of scholars. Father is currently serving as the Vice Minister of Public Works. How could a son of the Bennet family bring shame to his father and the family?"
The elderly lady observed that Eleanor not only bore no ill will toward William Bennet, but also seemed to care for him, which eased her worries.
"Eleanor is right. It's all my fault. I, this old woman, have been negligent. I'll speak to the master later and ask him to quickly find a teacher to guide William."
Mrs. Chambers hadn't expected the situation to take such a turn, and even Clara Bennet was stunned, a little confused. Today's events were truly strange. Eleanor Bennet, who usually kept her distance from her younger brother, was unexpectedly acting differently today. Although Amelia Peterson felt displeased, she said nothing and only smiled in agreement. Eleanor Bennet shook her head and said,
"Grandmother, that's not suitable. William is still in the inner courtyard. How could a teacher come here to guide him?"
Hearing this, the elderly lady thought of her grandson, now 6 years old. At 7, he should be moving to his own quarters, and Henry Bennet had already moved out at 5. But to move out? And for a second son? Thinking about her son's attitude toward William Bennet, the elderly lady hesitated. A faint glint of calculation flashed in Eleanor Bennet's eyes. Today, she was determined to make the elderly lady agree to move William Bennet to the main courtyard. Don't think she genuinely cared for William Bennet. She simply didn't want Mrs. Chambers and Clara Bennet to ruin the boy. If he were to be spoiled, it would be under her terms.
The eldest miss truly thinks everything through, but William is too young. If he moves to the main courtyard, I'm afraid the servants won't be able to take proper care of him,"
Mrs. Chambers said, unwilling to let her precious son leave the inner courtyard at such a young age. Although she hoped her son would succeed, he was only 6 years old. Who would let their son leave the inner courtyard before the age of 7? Eleanor Bennet smiled gently.
"What are you saying, Mrs. Chambers? Do you think father would mistreat William? A child born of a concubine is still his son, and William is so obedient and intelligent, father will surely value him. William, don't you agree?"
Unexpectedly, William Bennet seemed absent-minded today and nodded fervently.
"Elder sister is right. Grandmother, I should follow in my brother's footsteps and move to the main courtyard. Staying cooped up in the inner courtyard, I won't learn anything at all."
William Bennet's words were a direct slap in the face to Mrs. Chambers. She had just complained about the difficulty of caring for him outside the inner courtyard, and her son immediately contradicted her on the spot. The elderly lady's gaze shifted back and forth between Mrs. Chambers and William Bennet, and she intentionally glanced at Amelia Peterson and Eleanor Bennet, momentarily unsure of what to do. Eleanor Bennet understood clearly that the elderly lady was merely dissatisfied with her mother, and had no intention of favoring an ordinary grandson. After all, her younger brother was also the maternal grandson of the Chambers family. With the Chambers family backing him in the future, the Bennet family would surely prosper.
"Grandmother, how about this? Let's consult father about it. Besides, moving out isn't something that can happen overnight. At the very least, father needs to hire a teacher to guide William, and proper arrangements must be made for his residence and servants."
The old matriarch nodded upon hearing this.
"Eleanor is always so thoughtful. Yes, there's no need to rush this matter. I will discuss it with your father. Your elder sister is right. As descendants of the Bennet family, we must not act disrespectfully." "Yes, I will remember."
This time, William Bennet respectfully saluted, which greatly pleased the old matriarch. Eleanor Bennet smiled inwardly. Convincing her father would not be difficult. At present, her parents were still very much in love, and as long as her mother spoke up, her father would undoubtedly comply. After leaving the grand hall, Amelia Peterson escorted Eleanor Bennet to her own silkwood court. Once all the servants were dismissed, Amelia wore a stern expression and said,
"Eleanor, do you realize the consequences of what you said today?" "Mother, don't worry. I know what I'm doing. Although William is a concubine's son, he still has to address you as his legitimate mother. If you could say a few kind words about William in front of father, suggesting that he be moved out of the inner courtyard, it would be even better. Seeing that you are not merely indulging a concubine's child, father would view you as virtuous and feel even more guilty toward you."
Amelia Peterson was startled. Why would her daughter say such things? After all, no matter how mature she seemed, she was only 10 years old. Noticing her mother's doubt, Eleanor Bennet smiled bitterly. If her mother knew that her current maturity had been gained at the cost of the lives of her blood relatives, would she be so angry as to cast her out?
"Mother, this injury of mine has taught me many things. Grandmother has always taught me to prioritize the family's interests, to be sensible, and to take care of the bigger picture." "Mother, isn't that exactly what I'm doing now? If William is moved outside and taught by father, outsiders will see you as a generous matriarch who doesn't neglect a concubine's child. Moreover, don't you already understand what kind of person Mrs. Chambers is?"
Hearing this, Amelia Peterson suddenly understood. Her thoughts wandered. Her daughter seemed worried about the concubine's son, but in reality, she was calculating for her own benefit. This move would not only enhance her reputation as a virtuous wife, but also remove William from the old matriarch and Susan Chambers' influence. It was truly a plan that killed 2 birds with 1 stone.
"Mother, grandmother has always doted on William, but she seems to dislike Henry somewhat. Isn't it because Henry is busy with his studies and rarely visits the inner courtyard? Over time, I fear grandmother will eventually be swayed by Mrs. Chambers.
Amelia Peterson was startled upon hearing this and asked in a low voice,
Eleanor, tell me honestly, did you overhear something?
Eleanor Bennet bit her lip gently, hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward 2 steps and whispered,
Mother, before I climbed the tree, I accidentally overheard Mrs. Chambers repeatedly mentioning the Chambers family. She also spoke about the bloodline of the Chambers family and even mentioned her unwavering loyalty to the Peterson family.
Although not talkative, every word she spoke sent chills down people's spines. Amelia Peterson's face darkened as she pressed her lips tightly together. The bloodline of the Chambers family? Could it be that Mrs. Chambers was trying to persuade the matriarch to pay more attention to her maternal family? And the phrase,
wholeheartedly devoted to the Peterson family,
wasn't that directed at her, the legitimate wife? Wait, that's not right. If she remembered correctly, the person teaching martial arts to Henry was the most skilled cousin in the clan, sent by her own brother, wasn't it? The matriarch and Mrs. Chambers were clearly wary of something, worried that if Henry achieved success in the future, he would only be loyal to the Peterson family, and no longer care about or assist the Chambers family. So, was Mrs. Chambers trying to badmouth her in front of the matriarch? In just a moment, Amelia Peterson thought through a lot. Although she disliked arguing with others over trivial matters, it didn't mean she couldn't see through their subtle schemes. She simply chose not to stoop to their level. Who would have thought that Mrs. Chambers, who appeared so honest, harbored such malicious intentions? She intended to use the matriarch's authority to alienate Henry, and instead focus on elevating William Bennet.
You deliberately did this to keep William Bennet away from Mrs. Chambers and the matriarch? Mother, William is still young and not inherently malicious. When he moves to the outer estate, Father will find him a tutor to teach foundational knowledge and the classics. Naturally, he won't be led astray by Mrs. Chambers. Moreover, he also needs someone to teach him proper etiquette and manners.
Though Eleanor Bennet's words carried some underlying implications, Amelia Peterson understood them well. Her intention was to have William Bennet learn to distinguish between the legitimate and illegitimate, to respect the legitimate mother. Otherwise, society would never accept him. Eleanor Bennet wanted William Bennet to be distanced not only physically but also ideologically. This strategy was more effective than others and benefited both her and the Bennet family. Most importantly, this suggestion immediately caused the matriarch to view Eleanor Bennet, her legitimate eldest daughter, in a new light. Amelia Peterson wasn't wrong at all. Regarding Eleanor Bennet's performance today, the matriarch was extremely pleased. In fact, after hearing Mrs. Chambers express dissatisfaction with Eleanor Bennet, she even frowned, a rare reaction.
And William is only 6 years old. How can he be sent to the outer estate like this? If he were a legitimate son, it might be acceptable. Outsiders wouldn't dare look down on him. But he's merely an illegitimate son, and you know the Lord has never valued him. What if? Who knows what the eldest daughter is scheming? Silence! How dare you casually criticize the legitimate eldest daughter of the Bennet family?
A raspy voice, tinged with a sinister undertone, echoed. Chapter 8. Virtuous Wife, Virtuous Daughter? Mrs. Chambers, upon hearing the voice, immediately trembled with fear, flustered and unsure of what to do. Clara Bennet, who had been standing beside her, also turned pale with fright. That voice unmistakably belonged to her grandfather. To him, as his granddaughter, there was no affection to speak of. Even sparing her a glance more than necessary would irritate him.
The master has returned? Why so early today? Did you catch any fish?
The matron smiled, trying to ease the tension. The master sat down with a huff, casting a sharp glance at the two before him. His piercing eyes made them uneasy, as though he could see straight through their bodies and souls. It felt as if every thought and secret was laid bare under the sunlight, impossible to conceal.
Humph. As a concubine, you lack even the slightest sense of propriety. Don't forget, Eleanor is the eldest daughter of this household. How dare a mere concubine like you speak so freely about her? Master, please forgive me. I realize my mistake,
Mrs. Chambers said, kneeling down. Seeing this, Clara Bennett's eyes flickered, and she too knelt beside her mother, pleading,
Grandfather, please calm down. My mother didn't mean any harm. She was just anxious about William wanting to move to the outer residence. I hope you can be magnanimous and forgive her.
Hearing this, the master paused, the teacup in his hand hovering midair. He took a few more sips before asking,
What exactly happened?
The matron then recounted the entire story of the day, neither biased nor taking sides, though her affection for William Bennet was evident in her words.
Was this Eleanor's suggestion?
The master asked.
Yes, master. I wasn't sure what decision to make, so I sought your guidance.
The matron replied. The master glared at her.
Since when did decisions about William become your responsibility? He is a descendant of the Bennet family. Naturally, such matters are for me and his father to decide. And Eleanor truly lives up to her title as the eldest daughter of the Bennet residence. She has the demeanor of a true elder sister. Not only does she disregard William's status, but she also wholeheartedly wishes for the siblings to work together and bring glory to the family. Truly, she is a blessing to the Bennet family.
The matron, hearing this, found the master's words reasonable. If it were an ordinary young lady, she certainly wouldn't have said such things. Although Eleanor suggested William move out, it was for his future. Thinking of Henry, who had to move to the outer residence from a young age, and now, at only 8 years old, was already so well-mannered, respectful to his elder sister, and kind to his younger brother, he was indeed a fine child of the Bennet family.
Enough, you may leave.
The master waved his hand dismissively, showing his impatience. As Mrs. Chambers and her daughter reached the hallway, they overheard the master instructing from inside.
Tell the kitchen to steam the fish I caught today. Eleanor loves steamed fish the most.
Hearing this, Mrs. Chambers turned red with anger, then pale.
Eleanor, our Eleanor?
She thought bitterly. Was the daughter she bore not also part of the Bennet family? And yet the master claimed to know Eleanor's preferences so well. But her own children, born from her very womb, were utterly insignificant in his eyes. The more Mrs. Chambers thought about it, the angrier she became. She twisted the handkerchief in her hands until it was completely wrinkled. In the end, she could only stomp her foot in frustration and lead Clara Bennet away. At dinner, George Bennet had returned, with little Henry Bennet trailing behind him. Being small and short, Henry naturally couldn't keep up with his father's long strides. All along the way, George walked briskly while Henry jogged to catch up. By the time they reached the main hall, everything was ready. The father and son washed their hands and faces before taking their respective seats, because there weren't many people in the Bennet residence. The old Master Bennet had only 3 sons and 1 daughter. The third son died in battle, and the second son was serving in a distant post, so only George Bennet's family remained in the residence. Due to this, the old master felt the house was too quiet on normal days, so he established a rule that the entire family must dine together unless there was a particular reason not to. The old master looked at Henry Bennet. Clearly, he had been running the entire way, yet there wasn't a hint of fatigue on his face, not even a drop of sweat. This made the old master realize that this child not only had a good temperament, but had also made significant progress in martial arts recently. After the meal, the servants cleared the dishes and served digestive tea. The old master began recounting stories about William Bennet. When George Bennet heard it was his eldest daughter's idea, he was initially taken aback. However, Upon meeting his daughter's bright, smiling gaze, he immediately felt reassured. His daughter was so sensible and well-behaved. Then, glancing at Amelia Peterson beside him, who merely smiled without speaking, he felt even more appreciative of his virtuous and understanding wife.
Grandfather, actually, regarding William's matter, Mother has long had her thoughts. However, she worried that Grandmother might be reluctant to part with William, and Mrs. Chambers has been taking good care of him, so she hesitated to bring it up. Today, Eleanor spoke up in haste, but it was actually Mother's intention.
Hearing this, George Bennet felt it made sense. After all, William Bennet was not born to the main wife, and if she said too much, it might upset his mother. Moreover, his daughter was only 10 years old this year. How could she have thought of enlightening her younger brother? Reflecting on it, it had to be his wife's idea. The old master was overjoyed after hearing this.
Excellent! To have such a virtuous and understanding daughter-in-law in the Bennet family is truly a blessing for us.
The old madam, however, felt somewhat uncomfortable after hearing this. But she couldn't refute it, as what the old master said was indeed reasonable.
Grandfather, Eleanor's injury has healed now. Eleanor would like to return to school. If I continue to rest, I'll forget everything I've learned.
The old master Bennet laughed heartily.
How could my Eleanor be that forgetful?
As he spoke, he glanced at her left arm, and, seeing that it was indeed fine, he felt relieved.
Eleanor's eagerness to learn is commendable. However, girls at her age, she's already 10, should focus on learning sewing and embroidery instead,
the old madam said with a smile. Eleanor Bennet glanced briefly at the two elders, said nothing, and merely lowered her head with a faint smile. The old master Bennet furrowed his brows.
My Eleanor is naturally intelligent. To restrict her to sewing and embroidery would be a waste of her talent. If she wants to go to school, let her go. After all, it's the family school of the Bennet family. There are no outsiders, so it's perfectly fine. Thank you, Grandfather. Grandfather, I'm only a year younger than my sister. May I also attend school?
Clara Bennet's slightly timid voice suddenly rang out, surprising everyone. Amelia Peterson caught Eleanor's gaze and smiled.
Clara is intelligent as well. If Eleanor goes alone, she might feel lonely. Why not let the two of them accompany each other?
Everyone was very pleased with Amelia Peterson's demeanor today. Clara Bennet felt content. Mrs. Chambers breathed a sigh of relief, while George Bennet, besides feeling grateful to his gentle wife, harbored a tinge of guilt. Everything seemed normal. But who could have known that beneath this calm exterior, turbulent undercurrents surged, and dark clouds loomed heavily. Chapter 9. Blood and She Striking the Heart?
Miss, you were right. I've collected the remnants of 10 decoctions, and 3 of them contain an additional ingredient compared to the others. I inquired about it, and the herb is called polygala root. It can cause nausea and vomiting but also has a sedative effect, making people drowsy and lethargic.
Eleanor Bennet nodded.
You've done well. Remember, keep this matter confidential for now, and don't tell anyone. I haven't left the courtyard these past few days, so Mrs. Chambers likely doesn't know my current condition and probably assumes I'm still taking that medicine.
Linda Young looked worried.
But miss, shouldn't we report this to the madam? If she finds out, she'll definitely inspect the kitchen and revoke Mrs. Chambers' management rights. You underestimate Mrs. Chambers too much.
Eleanor Bennet sighed and shook her head lightly.
If she were that easy to deal with, how could she have won over the old madam? How could she garner respect from the servants? Without some cunning, how could a mere concubine like her qualify to manage the kitchen affairs?
Nani. Victoria was stunned upon hearing this. Manage the kitchen affairs?
Miss, do you mean that her scheme to harm you is to distract the madam from household matters, forcing her to focus on caring for you, so that Mrs. Chambers can seize control of the kitchen management?
Eleanor Bennet smiled and nodded.
What do you think? Someone as shrewd as her would undoubtedly have a backup plan. Adding just a little polygala root won't kill anyone. If we make a fuss about it, Mrs. Chambers might bribe the family physician and claim it was meant to calm my nerves. Wouldn't that leave us with the stigma of falsely accusing my father's concubine?
Nanny Victoria nodded.
Your concerns are not unfounded, Mississippi. However, if we don't strip Mrs. Chambers of her kitchen management rights, what if she harms the madam next? Don't worry, I've already made arrangements. Mrs. Chambers isn't foolish. She wouldn't dare act recklessly after only a few days of taking over the kitchen.
Nanny Victoria thought about it and agreed. It had only been a few days since Mrs. Chambers took charge of the kitchen. How could she be bold enough to poison the concubine? Moreover, if Mrs. Chambers had already bribed the family physician, no matter what was in the medicine, the physician would cover for her. It seemed this matter required careful planning. Linda Young grew anxious as she listened but couldn't think of a solution. Her eyes reddened, and she almost burst into tears.
Nanny Victoria, do this.
Under the dim light, Nanny Victoria's expression revealed a hint of surprise. After a moment, she regained her composure.
Miss, isn't this too risky? Don't worry, just follow my instructions. If we want Mrs. Chambers to lose her kitchen management rights completely, this is the most effective way. Yes, Mississippi. I'll prepare immediately.
Time passed swiftly, and 4 days had already gone by. Eleanor Bennet visited the Grand Hall daily to pay her respects, but her complexion seemed slightly pale. Amelia Peterson, feeling distressed, only urged her to rest well. Today, Charles Russell, the imperial physician and childhood friend of George Bennet, arrived for a visit with his son. George Bennet and Henry Bennet were hosting Charles Russell in his study. They had just exchanged a few words when a young servant rushed in, panicked, and reported,
Master, the eldest young lady is in trouble.
What?
What happened? Master, Nanny Victoria from the rear courtyard has already sent someone to summon the household physician. Madam and the elder madam have also gone there. The eldest young lady suddenly vomited blood and then fell unconscious.
Hearing this, George Bennet was extremely worried. Henry Bennet immediately dashed out of the study, but quickly returned, clasping his hands in a respectful salute to Charles Russell.
Uncle Russell, I humbly beg for your help.
George Bennet also turned to Charles Russell.
Brother Russell, since you are here, please examine my daughter. Let's go! With something happening to my niece, I cannot stand idly by.
At this moment, chaos reigned at Moonlit Terrace. Eleanor Bennet lay unconscious on the bed, while Amelia Peterson sat by her side, constantly wiping away tears.
My poor daughter, why has it come to this? How could this happen so suddenly? How have you all been serving her?
The servants knelt on the ground, trembling. Linda Young stammered.
Madam, the eldest young lady had just taken her medicine. I do not know why she suddenly vomited blood.
Mrs. Chambers' eyelid twitched. Medicine? How coincidental. Clara Bennet, though only 9 years old, understood that her stepmother managed the kitchen, and the medicine must have come from the small medicine cabinet there. Wasn't this implying that her stepmother had harmed Eleanor Bennet? Still a child, Clara Bennet immediately pointed at Linda Young and scolded.
Nonsense! You wretched servant, you're clearly spouting lies. How could my elder sister suddenly vomit blood after taking her medicine? This is obviously because you servants didn't take proper care of her, and now you're trying to shift the blame onto others. How disgraceful!
As soon as these words were spoken, Amelia Peterson and the elder madam both frowned. Mrs. Chambers inwardly panicked and quickly pulled Clara Bennet aside. Kneeling, she said,
It is my failure in teaching her properly. I ask the elder madam for forgiveness.
The old madam's expression indeed turned somewhat unpleasant. She and Amelia Peterson were still present, So how could a mere concubine-born child dare to lecture the legitimate daughter's maid? Truly outrageous and lacking in manners. Amelia Peterson sneered coldly.
Why hasn't the physician arrived yet? Does it take waiting for the young lady to faint for another hour before he can be summoned?
These words implied that the physician did not hold the eldest young lady in any regard. Such a complaint demonstrated extreme dissatisfaction with the physician. In ordinary wealthy households, a physician like this would certainly not be retained. And once dismissed from a noble family, the physician's reputation would be utterly ruined. No one would dare to hire such a physician again.
Madam, the physician has arrived.
Nanny Victoria quickly wiped her sweat and stepped aside to make way for the physician to check the pulse. The physician furrowed his brows, instinctively glancing at Mrs. Chambers. Amelia Peterson was too preoccupied with worrying about Eleanor Bennet to notice, while Nanny Victoria, who had been instructed beforehand, quietly observed the interaction between the two.
The young lady is merely experiencing a momentary surge of emotions, perhaps due to some form of agitation or anger. Madam and lady, please rest assured. I will prescribe a remedy, and she will recover after taking it.
Amelia Peterson seemed unconvinced.
You're saying it's just a surge of emotions? Eleanor is still so young. How could she have such a temper?
Nanny Victoria also frowned slightly. If such words were to spread, it would harm the young lady's reputation. At her age, to already have such a temper, what would become of her as she grew older? What noble family would want to marry a young lady like that?
Nonsense! The young lady isn't suffering from a surge of emotions. She's been poisoned.
Chapter 10. The Physician's Confession. The sharp exclamation startled everyone in the room. Amelia Peterson staggered, nearly falling, her face pale as a sheet.
How does Lord Russell know? Eleanor, my child,
Amelia stammered, her expression filled with disbelief. Charles Russell's face was grim, and George Bennet, who accompanied him, looked even more severe, his expression dark as an impending storm, intimidating anyone who dared to look at him.
Madam, don't panic. First, let Lord Russell examine Eleanor's pulse.
The physician, upon hearing the name,
Lord Russell,
turned ghostly pale, his limbs trembling uncontrollably, and collapsed beside the bed, unable to move. Mrs. Chambers also staggered, biting her lip hard. Impossible. She hadn't ordered anyone to poison Eleanor. It couldn't be. But Charles Russell's next words pushed her into a bottomless abyss.
This is 7-heart her poison. Jack, write the prescription immediately. Yes, father.
A boy about Eleanor Bennet's age stepped forward to the desk, quickly jotting down the prescription as Charles Russell dictated.
Send someone to fetch the ingredients at once. Boil them down to 1 bowl from 2, and bring it back quickly.
Nanny Victoria hurriedly accepted the order, grabbing the prescription and preparing to leave, but she was stopped.
Nanny, don't rush. I'll accompany you. Since someone has tried to harm Eleanor, we cannot afford any carelessness with the antidote.
Nanny Victoria froze, looking toward the madam. Seeing her nod, Henry Bennet also insisted on going along, his face filled with anger, clearly convinced that someone had deliberately harmed his elder sister. George Bennet watched as Charles Russell finished performing acupuncture on his daughter, his face showing visible exhaustion. Only when his daughter gradually regained consciousness did he finally breathe a sigh of relief. As for the quack physician, he had already ordered the steward to drag him away for thorough interrogation. His daughter was clearly poisoned, yet that charlatan claimed it was merely a surge of emotions, utter nonsense. A child so young, how could they have a heart condition? Clearly, someone must be pulling the strings behind the scenes. Of course, George Bennet didn't need to voice this thought aloud. Everyone present, whether master or servant, understood it well.
Master, the quack doctor has confessed. He admitted to accepting bribes from Mrs. Chambers. Previously, she instructed someone to add polygala root into the eldest young lady's medicine every 2 days, causing her wounds to heal and then relapse repeatedly. However, he claims he doesn't know why Mrs. Chambers did this. As for today, the eldest young lady was indeed poisoned, but under Mrs. Chambers' hint, he claimed it was a case of blood and chi imbalance.
Upon hearing this, Mrs. Chambers immediately fell to her knees.
Master, madam, I've been wronged. Since the quack doctor entered the room, I haven't spoken a single word to him. Please, master, judge fairly.
George Bennett's face darkened.
Someone, go to the kitchen and investigate. Arrest all the maids and servants who had any contact with the young lady's medicine and interrogate them thoroughly. Yes, master.
It was clear that Charles Russell didn't believe Mrs. Chambers' words. Seeing Eleanor Bennet awake but still with pale, bluish lips, he asked with concern,
Eleanor, does your chest hurt badly?
Eleanor Bennet nodded weakly.
Daddy Russell, I'm having trouble breathing.
Even with such a short response, Eleanor spoke slowly and feebly. There was no need to examine her complexion to know she was struggling, still suffering from the effects of the poison.
Eleanor, don't be afraid. With Daddy Russell here, we'll make sure you're cured. Your brother Jack is personally preparing the medicine right now. He won't let anything happen to you. Thank you, Daddy Russell.
Before the investigation could yield any results, old Master Bennet entered the room. The moment he saw his beloved granddaughter in such a state, his heart broke. Eleanor Bennet had grown up under the care of him and the old madam, and naturally he doted on her more than the other children. Now, hearing that someone had poisoned her, the fury in his heart was indescribable. George Bennet was about to continue his questioning, but old Master Bennet shook his head. Although Charles Russell and George Bennet had been friends for many years, and the two families were closely connected, Charles was still an outsider. Family scandals should not be aired publicly, and old Master Bennet prided himself on not being humiliated to such an extent. Charles Russell understood his meaning and refrained from asking further questions. He simply waited for Jack Russell and Henry Bennet to bring the medicine, which Amelia Peterson then fed to Eleanor Bennet herself. About 15 minutes later, Charles Russell checked Eleanor's pulse again and said,
The antidote is starting to take effect. If nothing unexpected happens, 2 more doses should completely eliminate the toxin from Eleanor's body.
Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Naturally, the investigation into Eleanor Bennet's poisoning had to proceed. Charles Russell carefully examined the leftover medicine in the pot, and his expression darkened.
There's indeed 7 heart herb in here. Although the dosage isn't high, the previous physician was correct. If polygala root had been used earlier, adding 7 heart herb now would amplify its toxicity significantly. That's why Eleanor suddenly coughed up blood and fainted. Dr. Russell, will this poison leave any lasting effects on Eleanor? No, as long as she rests properly. After all, Eleanor is still young, and fortunately, the issue was discovered in time. Otherwise, if she had been treated as a case of blood and chi imbalance, I'm afraid Eleanor.
Charles Russell didn't finish his sentence, but everyone understood the gravity of the situation and the potentially dire consequences. By this time, Mrs. Chambers had been kneeling for a long while. She crawled out of the room, still kneeling, her mind consumed with thoughts of how to prove her innocence.
Susan Chambers, do you have anything to say for yourself? I always thought you were a good person. Otherwise, my mother wouldn't have entrusted you with managing the kitchen while I had to care for Eleanor. And now, look what you've done. You dared to harm my daughter.
Amelia Peterson angrily scolded. As Amelia finished speaking, the matriarch felt a bit embarrassed. After all, she was the one who decided to let Mrs. Chambers manage the kitchen, never expecting this woman would dare to harm the eldest daughter of the Bennet residence.
I am innocent! I am innocent! Madam, Please investigate thoroughly. This was absolutely not my doing. It must be that physician framing me. Please, master, look into this.
Clara Bennett was startled at this point.
No, no. Stepmother never intended to harm my elder sister. Stepmother only said to use a little polygala root. It wouldn't kill anyone.
As soon as she said this, Clara realized her slip and quickly covered her mouth, glancing at her grandfather seated in the chair. She stammered in panic.
No, that's not what I meant. Stepmother didn't order anyone to add the medicine.
The truth had already slipped out, and trying to cover it up now was futile. In the room, aside from Nani Victoria and Linda Young, only Henry Bennett and Jack Russell were present. Yet neither of them noticed the faintly purplish lips of Eleanor Bennett, who sat silently, her lips curling into a cold, beautiful smile. It was like the moon hanging high in the night sky, stunning yet distant. Chapter 11. Punishing Susan Chambers. George Bennett glared at the delicate yet frail Mrs. Chambers before him, fury blazing in his chest. He had never liked this concubine. If it weren't for his mother's insistence back then, he would never have taken her in. Out of respect for his mother, he had never treated her poorly. But who would have thought this woman would be so audacious as to harm his daughter?
Steward, have you finished the interrogation?
The steward, who had been waiting outside, entered promptly upon hearing the call.
Master, these are the statements from the kitchen staff. According to protocol, they were questioned individually. 2 maids and 3 servants had previously received favors from Mrs. Chambers. The one who added the polygala root to the medicine was the assistant kitchen manager, and the one who delivered the drugged medicine today was the maid
assigned to brew it. All of them have been tied up, awaiting your orders.
Upon hearing this, Mrs. Chambers' eyes rolled back, and she fainted on the spot. George Bennett looked down at her collapsed figure with disdain and coldly ordered,
Mrs. Chambers attempted to harm the eldest daughter. The evidence is conclusive. Drag her out, administer 20 lashes, and confine her to the winter garden. She is not to step outside. Her monthly allowance will be halved, and she will only be allowed 2 servants. Sell off the rest. Furthermore, the second daughter is not permitted to go near the winter garden. If she disobeys, she will be grounded.
Yes, master. Clara Bennett froze upon hearing this. Even as George Bennett ordered her removal, she remained dazed, not crying or protesting, simply staring blankly. Amelia Peterson was stunned. She hadn't expected George Bennett to so decisively forbid Mrs. Chambers from seeing her 2 children again. It seemed the master truly cherished Eleanor. Otherwise, he wouldn't have imposed such a severe punishment on Mrs. Chambers despite his respect for his mother. Moreover, dealing with concubines and servants in the household was traditionally her responsibility as the mistress. Yet, the master had personally intervened, clearly intending to send a message to the matriarch. At the same time, he wanted to shoulder all of the matriarch's displeasure himself, ensuring his mother wouldn't direct her anger toward Amelia. The old madam was about to plead, but suddenly caught sight of the icy gaze from the old master. She instantly shrank back in fear, not daring to utter another word.
Family affairs have always been managed by the daughter-in-law. Since when were they handed over to this lowly maid? Utterly absurd.
The old master's words were like a cold blade, piercing straight into the old madam's heart. With just one phrase,
lowly maid,
the fate of Mrs. Chambers was sealed. From now on, she would only be a lowly servant by George Bennett's side, no longer enjoying the status of a concubine. It must be understood that, although both were concubines, the difference between a proper concubine and a lowly maid was like night and day. A lowly maid didn't even have the right to her own courtyard, her status barely above that of a personal maid. Hearing the old master's heavy final words, the old madam's hands trembled. She gritted her teeth but said nothing. Amelia Peterson, seeing that everything had settled, turned back to the inner room to check on Eleanor. The commotion outside was loud, and everyone in the room naturally heard it clearly. Eleanor Bennet, upon hearing how Mrs. Chambers was dealt with, let out a sigh of relief. At least, for now, Mrs. Chambers wouldn't be able to stir up trouble anymore. However, with only half a month left until the day Henry drowned in her past life, she wondered, now that Mrs. Chambers no longer had capable people by her side, would she still dare to plot against Henry? As she recalled lying there earlier and not hearing Clara Bennet's cries, Eleanor Bennet felt something was off. Clara Bennet was extremely cunning and adept at pretending. Today, since she hadn't cried, could it be that she now harbored a deep-seated hatred for Eleanor and her mother? "Eleanor, does your chest still hurt?" Eleanor Bennet snapped out of her thoughts and saw the concern in Jack Russell's eyes. She had always been aware of Jack Russell's feelings for her. It was just that in her past life, she had foolishly devoted herself to that ungrateful man, ultimately leading to Jack Russell, whom she had always regarded as an elder brother, being killed as well. Now, seeing Jack Russell standing alive and well in front of her, she couldn't help but feel overjoyed. "It doesn't hurt any more, thank you, Brother Jack." Although she said it didn't hurt, the occasional twitch at the corner of her mouth suggested otherwise. It was likely that she said so intentionally to reassure Henry Bennet, who was standing beside her. "Eleanor, it's all my fault for not protecting you. I promise I won't let those vile people have another chance to harm you again. How dare they plot against my Eleanor?" Amelia Peterson exclaimed as she entered the room, her eyes reddened upon seeing her daughter's pale face. "Aunt, don't worry. Eleanor will recover soon," Jack reassured. "Thank you, Jack. If it weren't for your father being there today, I fear." Amelia Peterson's voice trailed off as tears began to fall again. The handling of Mrs. Chambers caused an uproar in the Bennet residence. Previously, before she gained control of the kitchen, Mrs. Chambers had treated the servants kindly, rarely scolding or punishing them, which earned her a good reputation in the household. Moreover, the old matron was her aunt and often showed favoritism, so many of the servants respected her greatly. However, the moment the master's orders were issued, Mrs. Chambers immediately became like a dog fallen into water, with everyone eager to throw stones at her. All the servants in Mrs. Chambers' courtyard were expelled from the residence by the steward and sold off. Only 2 remained to tend to her in the winter garden, a third-rank maid who was never favored and an elderly maidservant. The master hadn't specified which 2 should stay, but from his attitude, the steward naturally understood. There was no way he would leave Mrs. Chambers with competent servants to command. Furthermore, the crime of plotting against the legitimate daughter of the household would follow Mrs. Chambers for the rest of her life, an indelible stain until her death. In the great Eldoria, the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate was always clear. A mere concubine daring to harm the legitimate daughter would never be respected. Thus, Mrs. Chambers' fate was sealed. Already out of favor, she now bore such infamy that even the old matron could no longer shield her. In the eyes of the steward and others, the master sparing Mrs. Chambers from death or expulsion from the residence was already a great concession, considering the face of the old matron and the Chambers family. The next day, Eleanor Bennet appeared much better, but Nanny Victoria felt a pang of sorrow as she said, "Miss, there were many ways to deal with Mrs. Chambers. Was it necessary to go this far? You don't understand." Eleanor Bennet shook her head. "If I hadn't done this, how could Father have been ruthless with her? Don't forget, Father is a filial man. While he doesn't obey Grandmother's every word, it's close to that. If Mrs. Chambers had only committed a minor offense, Father might not have had the resolve to punish Susan Chambers." Eleanor Bennet sighed softly. "This time, for my sake, Father defied Grandmother for the first time." Chapter 12. Brothers Practicing Calligraphy. Mr. Chambers had been punished,
But Eleanor Bennet knew well that the matter wasn't that simple, at least not with Clara Bennet involved. If she believed that her father's order could stop Clara Bennet from meeting Mrs. Chambers, then she was far too naive. Mrs. Chambers had been at the Bennet residence for many years, always appearing generous and gentle, currying favor not only with people within her own courtyard. Moreover, Clara Bennet had the old madam backing her. How could Eleanor possibly underestimate her? A light blue figure lingered outside the gate of the winter garden for a long time, until the gatekeeper received silver coins from Megan Lee and rushed inside. Meanwhile, the maid named Megan Lee stood guard at the door, whispering,
"Miss, you must hurry, and under no circumstances let anyone find out. I know, guard the door carefully. I'll be right out."
Not far from the winter garden, a faint purple figure emerged from the shade of a nearby sycamore tree. That delicate face curled into a slight smirk, and a glint of inexplicable hatred flashed in her eyes. "Clara Bennet, if you hadn't gone to see her, then I would have been worried. If it were an ordinary concubine, after this incident, she would undoubtedly have no chance of rising again." But Eleanor Bennet knew that this woman was no ordinary concubine. She was the old madam's biological niece. She also had a well-off family backing her, not as wealthy as Amelia Peterson's maternal side, but still a family of officials. Eleanor Bennet saw Clara Bennet enter the winter garden, a faint smile playing on her lips, but her heart was filled with hatred, like a raging storm surging violently in her chest. Her fingers clenched tightly, her exquisite nails digging into her palms. Though they didn't break the skin, the marks wouldn't fade in just one day. "Clara Bennet, Susan Chambers, is this all it takes for you to crumble? Ha! This is just the beginning. Just wait and see. The pain you caused me back then, I will make you pay back 100-fold. You want to harm my little brother, don't you? Fine. I'll grant your wish. After all, William still has to call me elder sister, doesn't he?" Eleanor Bennet turned and left, not returning to her moonlit terrace, but heading straight to Camellia Garden. At that moment in Camellia Garden, Henry Bennet was reading aloud to Amelia Peterson while a young boy, William Bennet, sat nearby. Since Mrs. Chambers had been confined and stripped of her attendants, William Bennet had been brought to Camellia Garden, where Amelia Peterson personally took care of him. Toward this illegitimate child, Amelia Peterson neither felt affection nor harbored hatred. After all, he was the master's flesh and blood, and Amelia Peterson wasn't a cruel person. She had no intention of taking revenge on a child. Eleanor Bennet arrived at the door, not entering immediately but standing outside the curtain, listening to her younger brother finish reading from the primer. Only then did she signal the maid to lift the curtain.
"It's been a few days, and my younger brother's studies have improved
remarkably. Sister."
As soon as they saw her enter, Henry Bennet and William Bennet ran toward her. William was a step slower, though, whether due to his young age, short legs, or a slight hesitation toward his elder sister and older brother was unclear.
"Is sister feeling better?"
Eleanor Bennet nodded.
"Much better. Brother Jack comes every day to watch me take my medicine. How could I not recover quickly?"
With that, she noticed William Bennet standing behind Henry Bennet and smiled as she asked,
"William, listening to your brother read, do you feel inspired?"
Hearing his sister's question, William Bennet's eyes lit up, and he nodded enthusiastically.
"Brother is so amazing. William, do you want to study?"
William Bennet eagerly nodded his head repeatedly. Beside him, Henry Bennet suddenly looked displeased, pouting as if he felt William was competing with him for their sister's attention.
"Henry, you're the elder brother. Shouldn't you set an example for your younger brother?"
"Of course." Henry Bennet immediately popped out his chest, his face full of pride.
"As the elder brother, I must love my younger siblings and strive to be a role model for them." "Henry, that's very well said. Currently, you don't have a younger sister, only a younger brother. So shouldn't you teach William often?
Henry Bennet thought for a moment, his eyes suddenly lighting up.
Sister, you're right. That's exactly what I should do. Good then. Mother, why don't you prepare the 4 treasures of the study, so the 2 brothers can practice their writing on the long bench?
Amelia Peterson smiled upon hearing this.
Henry can manage, but does William even know how to write? If William doesn't know, then we're here to help him.
Eleanor Bennet replied, walking over to Amelia Peterson.
Letting the 2 brothers spend more time together can only bring benefits, not harm.
Amelia Peterson thought it over and agreed. After all, there were only these 2 sons in the Bennet residence at the moment. When they grew up, wouldn't they need to rely on each other? She waved her hand, instructing the servants to prepare the writing materials, then picked up her needlework and sat to the side, beginning to sew. Meanwhile, Eleanor Bennet joined the 2 brothers to practice writing. Eleanor Bennet had carefully calculated the time. At most, it would be another quarter of an hour before their father returned. Thinking about today's unusual circumstances, a shadow briefly flickered in Eleanor's eyes. William Bennet visited their mother daily to pay his respects, but in their previous life, William had argued with Henry out of dissatisfaction with his brother's education. Their mother had scolded William for being disrespectful to his elder brother, and just as their father entered Silkwood Court, he overheard William crying. Without stepping inside, he had assumed their mother was too harsh on their second son. In this life, Eleanor was determined to change everything and ensure their father did not misunderstand their mother. What Eleanor hadn't anticipated was that, in their previous life, only their father returned to Silkwood Court. In this life, however, their father had come back with their grandfather. George Bennet stood in the courtyard and asked the maidservants who was inside the room. After hearing their response, he signaled them to remain silent and invited the old patriarch to walk over to the corridor, stopping just outside the eastern room's window.
Elder sister, why does my writing look like a caterpillar?
George Bennet recognized the voice of his second son.
Let me see. William, for your first time holding a brush, this is already very good.
The clear and gentle voice unmistakably belonged to Eleanor Bennet.
But why does elder brother write so beautifully while I can't? Your elder brother is 2 years older than you, so of course, it's different. By the time you're his age, you might even write better than him.
Henry Bennet, hearing this, protested indignantly.
Sister, you're biased. You only praise William.
Amelia Peterson, overhearing, chuckled and said,
Henry, you're the elder brother. Why are you being so petty? Your elder sister is giving more attention to your younger brother because he's still little and needs more guidance. All right, you've been practicing for a while now. Are you tired? Would you like some snacks?
Yes, I would. William Bennet immediately tossed his brush aside and was about to climb off the bench when Henry Bennet sternly shouted,
Don't move.
Chapter 13. Breaking out in a rash. Amelia Peterson was stunned, glancing at William Bennet, who stood frozen in place.
What's wrong? Weren't you behaving so well just now?
Henry Bennet suddenly put on a stern face and said,
Mother, you wouldn't know this, but Father has taught me many times that the 4 treasures of the study, whether it's the thinnest piece of paper or the heaviest inkstone, are things a scholar must cherish. Yet, the moment my younger brother heard about cakes, he started scribbling recklessly, ruining a perfectly good sheet of paper and wasting several drops of ink. He even waved the precious wolf hair brush so hard that a few bristles fell out. Such behavior is unworthy of a student.
Henry Bennet's words left not only Amelia Peterson, but also Eleanor Bennet dumbfounded. Earlier, upon hearing Henry Bennet's scolding, Eleanor had thought something was amiss. She assumed the boy was forbidding William Bennet from eating cakes here, and was about to send him away. Now, it seemed she could breathe a sigh of relief.
Ha ha! Well said. Henry, well said. A scholar truly must treasure every word and every sheet of paper. Excellent. This school is indeed a great place to learn, and the teachers are excellent too.
George Bennet, hearing the old master's praise, puffed up slightly with pride.
Father, those words the boy just said are clearly a result of my good teaching.
The old master glared at him.
Oh, only you taught him? Are the family tutors here just for show?
As soon as the old master finished his sentence, several people lowered their heads, stifling their laughter so hard their faces twisted.
Today is the Dragon Boat Festival. It's a pity we're in the capital and can't watch dragon boat races. If we were back in the southern marches, it would surely be lively.
The old master lamented. Eleanor Bennet, knowing well that the Bennet family's ancestors hailed from the southern marches, where many family members still resided, asked,
Grandfather, are you missing your hometown? Good child, when I was young, every dragon boat festival, I would go with my friends to watch the dragon boat races and throw zongzi together. Now, I can only eat zongzi. Grandfather, I heard from Nani Victoria that Mother woke up early this morning to personally make zongzi in the kitchen. They should be ready to eat by now, shouldn't they?
Really?
Mother made zongzi? I love Mother's zongzi the most. Is there red bean filling this year? Red bean is my favorite.
Henry Bennet exclaimed excitedly. Eleanor Bennet smiled. In her previous life, because of her fluctuating health, her mother had forgotten about the Dragon Boat Festival. Instead, Mrs. Chambers had taken it upon herself to make zongzi, drawing everyone's attention in the household. Even Grandfather, who usually disliked her, had shown her some kindness. In this life, Mrs. Chambers undoubtedly had the same intention. Otherwise, why would she have tried to poison Eleanor? However, this time, she likely hadn't anticipated that the person earning favor would be Eleanor's mother instead. Sure enough, as soon as the old master heard that the zongzi were personally made by his daughter-in-law, he nodded and smiled.
You are the matriarch of this household, managing all internal affairs. It's already a lot of work. Why go to the trouble of doing it yourself? These tasks should be left to the servants. Yes, Father. But it's the Dragon Boat Festival, and this is just a small token of my respect as your daughter-in-law. Moreover, most of the servants in the household are from the north, and don't know how to make meat-filled zongzi to your and my husband's liking. I was worried they wouldn't turn out well, so I decided to make them myself. Good. It's rare to see such filial devotion from you. Father, in that case, shall we have someone prepare wine and food in the backyard garden, so we can enjoy both the meal and the flowers together?
George Bennet suggested.
All right. Let's go,
the old master said, taking Henry Bennet by one hand and Eleanor Bennet by the other.
Come, let's take a walk in the backyard garden with Grandpa.
As expected, Eleanor Bennet noticed the envious look in William Bennet's eyes.
Father, why don't you look after William? Henry and I will go with Grandpa first.
Hearing this, William Bennet looked at his elder sister with gratitude. George Bennet was momentarily taken aback, then smiled, taking William Bennet's hand as they walked outside together. Amelia Peterson, though puzzled by her daughter's concern for this illegitimate younger brother, felt no need to dwell on it. After all, seeing the family harmonious and the old master and master of the house pleased was enough for her. Besides, the boy had grown up by now. What could she do? Put him back into Susan Chambers' womb? The group quickly made their way to the octagonal pavilion in the rear garden, all smiles, except for the old matriarch, who seemed a bit uneasy.
Madam, the second young lady has suddenly fallen ill, breaking out in red rashes all over her body. Please have mercy and save her.
Amelia Peterson looked closely and recognized Nanny Bethany.
What's going on? Why the sudden rash? Has the household doctor been summoned? Madam, after the poisoning incident involving the eldest young lady last time, The previous household doctor was dismissed. The new doctor recommended by Lord Russell won't officially start until tomorrow.
Amelia Peterson suddenly recalled the matter.
Then go outside and invite another physician immediately. The second young lady must be examined first.
Yes, madam. George Bennet and the others remained silent. Only William Bennet, after a moment of shock, hurried to Nanny Bethany's side.
How is my second sister? Is she seriously ill? Young master, the second young lady currently has a slight fever and is being attended to by the servants. Although they're a bit clumsy, they are taking care of her.
This statement clearly carried an undertone. As expected, the old matriarch frowned immediately.
George, Clara is Mrs. Chambers' biological daughter. Now that she's suddenly fallen ill, why not have Mrs. Chambers attend to her for a few days? The daughter-in-law has the whole household to manage, and Eleanor has just recovered from her illness. Mrs. Chambers would be the best choice. Once Clara gets better, you can confine Mrs. Chambers again.
George Bennet hesitated and looked toward Amelia Peterson. Amelia instinctively turned her gaze to Eleanor Bennet. Seeing Eleanor Bennet subtly nod, Amelia, though still confused, realized she couldn't go against the old matriarch's words.
Very well, let's follow Mother's suggestion. Husband, we can confine Mrs. Chambers again after Clara recovers.
George Bennet, hearing Amelia Peterson's words and noticing William Bennet's hopeful eyes, nodded.
Go ahead.
Nanny Bethany, hearing the master's approval, quickly left. After Mrs. Chambers entered the room, the physician who had been summoned also arrived. The old matriarch, naturally concerned, had someone assist her in going to check. With her departure, Amelia Peterson couldn't sit still in the pavilion either and went to inquire. William Bennet insisted on going along, and Eleanor Bennet took his hand, accompanying him as they followed. The gaze of old Master Bennet flickered, but he said nothing, focusing solely on eating his rice dumplings. Seeing that Henry Bennet was still there, the grandfather and grandson began discussing the Dragon Boat Festival and reciting poetry. Amelia Peterson had just entered the courtyard when she overheard the physician saying it was likely measles, and that medicine was being distributed everywhere. Chapter 14. Susan Chambers' Scheme. As soon as Amelia Peterson heard this, she looked at the two children trailing behind her and immediately ordered someone to stop them.
You two should go back. It seems Clara has measles, and this disease is highly contagious. You're still young, don't go in there. If you catch it, there will be another sick person in the household.
Yes, Mother. Eleanor Bennet held William Bennet's hand as the two stood at the entrance of the courtyard, their faces filled with worry as they looked toward the main room. William Bennet suddenly felt a warmth in his heart. He had just been peeling rice dumplings for fun, and although his nanny had wiped his hands with a cloth before they arrived, they hadn't been washed with clean water. The sticky residue from the rice dumpling leaves still made him uncomfortable when he thought about it. Yet, his elder sister held his hand without showing any disdain for his dirtiness. The two waited for about a quarter of an hour before they saw Amelia Peterson helping the elderly matron out. When the elderly matron saw her beloved granddaughter covered in small red spots, her heart, already heavy, ached even more. Upon stepping outside and seeing Eleanor Bennet standing with William Bennet, her mood lightened somewhat.
Why are you still waiting here? Eleanor, take your brother to the back garden to play. It's fine as long as you stay close and avoid the wind. Once the measles run their course, she'll recover. Yes, grandmother.
Measles? Eleanor Bennet's heart turned cold with a sneer. How could it be measles? Others might not know, but how could she not? Mrs. Chambers was truly cunning, using this ploy not only to temporarily lift her confinement, but also to gain sympathy by exploiting her sick daughter. Humph! I won't let you have your way.
Grandmother, I remembered hearing Brother Jack say before that children with measles shouldn't be exposed to wind, shouldn't eat cold foods, and must avoid anything fishy. But how many days has my younger sister had measles? She can't go outside, can't be nourished. Wouldn't that be too pitiful?
Seeing Eleanor Bennett's concern, and hearing her deliberately mention dietary restrictions, Amelia Peterson quickly instructed the nanny to prepare only thin rice porridge for Clara Bennett in the coming days.
Mother, how will my younger sister endure this?
The elderly matron, of course, knew that children with measles should avoid fishy foods, even eggs. But recalling Clara Bennett's face earlier, she thought that to prevent scarring in the future, this was the only way. It would only be a few days of
hardship. What child hasn't gone through it? Back then, Eleanor had measles too, and wasn't she just fine? Isn't she still beautiful now?
Eleanor, don't worry, all children are like this. Back then, you had measles at an even younger age than Clara, and didn't you turn out fine?
Eleanor Bennett nodded hesitantly, half believing, as she felt the sleeve beside her shift. Turning her head, she saw William Bennett.
Sister, don't worry. I've heard from grandmother and aunt before. Children getting measles isn't anything serious. It just means no meat for a few days. What's the big deal?
Eleanor Bennett smiled faintly, with a hint of something unreadable.
William, you're right. I've overthought it. Let's go. I'll take you to the back garden.
The old madam, seeing Eleanor Bennett treating William Bennett kindly, felt a surge of joy in her heart. Though he was the second son, he was still a part of the Bennett family's bloodline. Currently, there were only 2 boys in the household, and in the future, they would surely have to depend on one another. Eleanor Bennett held William Bennett's hand, strolling leisurely while chatting. No one could tell that, at this very moment, Eleanor Bennett harbored a deep-seated hatred for this seemingly innocent younger brother. The scene from years ago, when he tricked their father into drinking poisoned wine, flashed vividly in her mind. The agonized cries, the painful struggle on their father's face, were etched deeply in her memory. The maniacal and triumphant smiles of Susan Chambers and William Bennett back then stood in stark contrast. That was his own father. How could he be so cruel?
Sister, you're hurting me.
Eleanor snapped out of her thoughts, startled, and quickly apologized.
I'm sorry, William. It's my fault. Does it still hurt?
William Bennett shook his head.
Not anymore. Sister, do you have something on your mind? I'm just worried about Clara. She's only 9 this year, still growing. Without meat, fish, eggs, and milk, I'm afraid she won't grow tall. But with a rash, she really can't eat those things. You're so kind, sister. Second sister used to always speak ill of you.
Realizing his slip, the boy quickly covered his mouth with his hands, fearfully glancing at Eleanor Bennett.
It's fine. Your second sister isn't a bad person. She just speaks bluntly and has a short temper. William, you're a man. In the future, you'll have to achieve great things and can't always focus on the matters of the inner household. Otherwise, it will narrow your vision and stifle your ambitions. Do you understand? Yes, sister, I understand. It's not teaching, just something I wanted to say. Let's go!
Mrs. Chambers, Clara Bennett, take your time playing your games. I want to see who's truly more skillful in the end. And William Bennett. Eleanor Bennett's lips curved slightly into a smirk. Ha! I'll make him gradually grow close to me and mother. As for you vile women, you'll be the ones he grows to despise and detest. In the end, I'll make sure you taste the pain of being schemed against and betrayed by your own flesh and blood. Raising her face to embrace the radiant golden sunlight, her smile grew even warmer. William Bennett, holding her hand and gazing at her, could only see her as a celestial being descending to earth, pure, radiant, and warm. The brilliant golden light made William Bennett want to immerse himself in it with her, even sparking a sudden desire to stay by her side forever. 2 days later, Clara Bennett's illness not only showed no signs of improvement, but had worsened, leaving the entire household in deep worry. Especially the elderly matron, who dearly loved her granddaughter. If anything happened to her, how could she bear it? This measles outbreak was supposed to erupt outward as soon as possible to reduce the fever. However, if it didn't break out, the patient would continue with a high fever, which could lead to cognitive impairment or even death, an uncertain and dreadful outcome. As of now, news spread that Clara Bennett's measles had yet to appear, naturally causing great anxiety within the household. That day, George Bennett had just returned home, changed his clothes, and rushed straight to Clara Bennett's courtyard. After all, she was his biological daughter. How could he not feel distressed? As he reached the hallway, he heard the heart-wrenching cries of Mrs. Chambers, which tightened George Bennett's chest. Could it be? He hurried into the room, where Nanny Bethany drew back the curtains, wiping her tears as she said,
"Master, you've returned. Please, master, save the second young lady. What's going on?"
Upon hearing the master's voice, Mrs. Chambers turned around and suddenly knelt down.
"Master, please, master, if any mistakes were made, they are my fault alone and have nothing to do with Clara. I beg you, master and madam, to have mercy and save Clara."
Chapter 15. A conspiracy to harm one's own child. Hearing this, George Bennett felt a pang of dread in his heart. How could this matter involve his wife? Clara's rash outbreak. What could his wife possibly do to help?
"Get up. What exactly is wrong with Clara? Why all this crying here?"
Hearing George Bennett's displeased tone, Mrs. Chambers wiped her tears and said,
"Master, it's been 2 days now, and despite taking the medicine, Clara's rash still hasn't appeared. Just now, the household physician came to examine her and was puzzled too. The rash should have erupted yesterday, but for some reason, there's still no sign of it. Then summon the physician again. What can madam, as a woman, do to help?" "Yes, master, I was just overly anxious earlier, and will send someone to call the physician again." "Yes, madam, I've already gone to summon the physician, but Ron Burgundy in the outer courtyard said he had been called by madam to Silkwood Court nearly half an hour ago, and hasn't returned yet,"
replied a young maid named Megan Lee, somewhat nervously, before bowing her head in silence.
"Go invite him again. Could it be that the physician will stay forever at Silkwood Court? This is the inner courtyard."
Mrs. Chambers appeared to be scolding the young maid, but her words carried a different implication when they reached George Bennett's ears. A physician newly arrived and already at Silkwood Court? And for nearly half an hour? How could this be? His wife hailed from a noble family, renowned as a talented woman, and her reputation had remained impeccable over the years. Surely, she wouldn't do anything improper. Yet, despite his reasoning, unease lingered in his heart. Casting a glance at Clara Bennett, George Bennett let out a cold snort and strode straight towards Silkwood Court.
"How is it? Has everything been arranged properly?" "Rest assured, everything has been taken care of." "Are there any traces left behind?"
Mrs. Chambers still felt uneasy, her heart restless. Especially when she thought of Eleanor Bennett's bright, clear eyes, a pang of guilt struck her. Mrs. Chambers shook her head slightly. Why was she suddenly afraid of a mere child? How could the girl possibly suspect that she had ordered someone to drug the physician's tea? At this moment, when the master arrived, he would surely witness the
caught in the act
scene exactly as planned. As George Bennett stepped into Silkwood Court, he immediately noticed the number of servants in the courtyard had significantly decreased, with only a few unfamiliar faces tending to the bamboo clusters near the southern wall. This sight unsettled him. Standing on the green stone tiles, he gazed toward the bedroom, inexplicably hesitant to move forward. After a moment's hesitation, he finally strode toward the corridor. Inside, an unusual silence prevailed. Upon closer inspection, all the windows of the northern wing were tightly shut. This only deepened George Bennett's unease. Pulling aside the curtain as he entered, he saw several maids standing respectfully in the main room. From the inner chamber, faint sounds of groaning could be heard. Upon listening closely, they resembled the cries of a child.
"Greetings, master."
George Bennet ignored them, and headed straight into the inner chamber. Upon entering, he saw Amelia Peterson wiping away tears with a handkerchief, while on the bed lay a small figure. Looking carefully, it was William Bennet. The newly arrived physician was taking William Bennet's pulse.
"What's going on here?" "Master, I don't know either. The two children were practicing their writing in the western middle room, and everything seemed fine. Then, out of nowhere, Eleanor said William's face looked a little flushed. I checked and noticed he seemed feverish, so I had someone summon Dr. Stephen Strange. Isn't it? Where is Eleanor?"
George Bennet looked around, but did not see his eldest daughter, growing slightly suspicious.
"Dr. Stephen Strange suspects it might be measles, so I had Eleanor sent back to Moonlit Terrace. After all, it's a contagious illness, and Eleanor has just recovered from being sick. I didn't want her to catch it."
As Amelia Peterson finished speaking, Dr. Stephen Strange also completed his examination and clasped his hands together in respect as he reported to George Bennet.
"Master, the young master currently only has a fever, but it seems unlikely to subside tonight. He has been given some fever-reducing medicine, but the most important thing now is to let the measles rash emerge. Otherwise, the young master will feel very uncomfortable." "Has William also caught measles?" "Hayes, well, it's common for children to get measles. Maybe he caught it from Clara." "Master, once someone has had measles, they won't get it again. However, it's quite rare for noble children to contract measles. How could it be that both our young ones have fallen ill at the same time? If we're not careful and they scratch their faces, it will be a huge problem,"
Amelia Peterson said worriedly.
"You're
right. This is indeed strange. Dr. Stephen Strange, is there no other way? I heard Clara hasn't even broken out in rashes after 2 days?"
Dr. Stephen Strange hesitated, seemingly unsure whether to speak or not. His hesitation did not escape the sharp eyes of George Bennet, who noticed everything. "What is it?" George asked.
"Master, it seems the measles on the second young master don't appear to have come naturally, but were transmitted from the second young Mississippi. If it were natural, it would have started with a few red spots, followed by fever either the same day or the next. But now, the second young master has a fever first, and no rashes have appeared yet." "You mean someone deliberately infected William with measles?"
"Yes, master." Amelia Peterson was startled and horrified, but she quickly grasped the situation.
"Someone, call everyone who has been in contact with the second young master over the past 2 days here for questioning. Also, gather all the items the second young master has touched today. Furthermore, send someone to Moonlit Terrace to fumigate the eldest young lady's room. Make sure no one else contracts this terrible illness."
"Yes, madam." George Bennet was naturally pleased with Amelia Peterson's arrangements. She left someone to watch over William Bennet, and then stepped into the corridor to question the others. After some interrogation, the wet nurse of William Bennet seemed nervous, her gaze flickering. This subtle action did not escape George Bennet's notice. He exchanged a glance with Amelia Peterson, who immediately ordered the wet nurse to step forward.
"Nani Bethany, you are the wet nurse of the second young master, and have served this household for many years. You're also the younger sister of Nani Bethany serving the second young Mississippi. Tell me, how did the second young master suddenly contract this strange illness?"
Nanny Bethany was so frightened that her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, trembling.
"Madam, please spare me. Madam, please spare me. This was all Mrs. Chambers' doing. It has nothing to do with me."
Everyone was shocked upon hearing this, especially Amelia Peterson.
Nonsense. Mrs. Chambers is the biological mother of this second young master. Why would she harm her own son? Do you think the master and I would believe such wild accusations? I dare not lie, madam. Mrs. Chambers instructed someone to take the second young Mrs. used handkerchief and give it to me, ordering me to let the second young master use it.
These words left everyone stunned. Mrs. Chambers harming her own son? This was beyond horrifying. Chapter 16, Uncovering the Truth. The revelation left everyone in disbelief. No matter how cruel Mrs. Chambers might be, how could she gamble with her own son's life?
Master, madam, I dare not lie. Mrs. Chambers said this isn't actually measles, but a similar illness called pseudomeasles. She claimed that as long as the second young master used the second young Mrs. handkerchief, she would handle everything else. Not only would the second young master remain unharmed, but it would also make the master suspect the madam. Suspect?
Amelia Peterson was stunned, her face turning pale. She lightly covered her lips with a handkerchief and murmured,
How could this be? No matter how malicious Mrs. Chambers is, she wouldn't scheme against me using her own son's life, would she?
George Bennett's expression darkened upon hearing this. At this point, what wasn't clear? It was evident that Mrs. Chambers had deliberately infected William Bennett with pseudomeasles to frame the madam for mistreating her stepson. Susan Chambers, how despicable!
Master, it's impossible. Although Mrs. Chambers has some schemes, she has always loved William. How could she act so cruelly towards him? What if? Master, I'm a mother too. How could any mother harm her own child?
Amelia Peterson spoke, her eyes red and lips trembling, clearly frightened by Nanny Bethany's words. George Bennett gently held her hand.
Don't worry, my lady. The truth will come to light. I believe that maid has confessed everything. This must be Susan Chambers' doing. Don't fret, Dr. Stephen Strange said to administer the fever medicine first. If all goes well, the rash might appear tonight.
Amelia Peterson nodded, her eyes brimming with tears, struggling to hold them back. At this moment, inside the room, William Bennett had slightly regained consciousness and could clearly hear the conversation outside. The boy was instantly stunned. As young as William Bennett was, how could he endure such a shock? His mind echoed with the words, "It was my stepmother. My stepmother acted cruelly against me. She wants me to catch measles to frame my mother?" William Bennett, after thinking over and over, couldn't bear it any longer and burst into loud sobs. Hearing her son cry, Amelia Peterson hurried back into the room. At that moment, the old madam arrived, supported by others. "What is going on here? I heard someone tried to harm my grandson." Who dares to be so bold as to lay a hand on my precious boy?" The old madam had been chanting prayers in her room, but the hurried footsteps of several maids outside had alarmed her. Upon inquiry, she learned her beloved grandson had also started showing a rash. How old was William Bennett? Moreover, he was perfectly fine under Amelia Peterson's care. Why was it that Henry Bennett was unharmed, and none of the other servants were affected, but only William Bennett had a fever? Clearly, Amelia Peterson was deliberately mistreating the concubine's child. Little did the old madam know that her preconceived notions had now deeply wronged her cherished granddaughter, Susan Chambers. "Mother, why are you here?"
George Bennett frowned slightly and asked.
"What? Am I, an old woman, not allowed to come to Silkwood Court anymore? Mother, please don't be angry. That's not what I meant. My lady is in the room taking care of William. He just woke up and cried loudly, so she went in to check."
The old madam snorted coldly.
"How considerate of her."
The old madam's attitude only further convinced George Bennett of the entire matter. Initially, he had some doubts about Nanny Bethany's confession, but now, with the old madam entering and immediately insinuating that his wife harmed William. It was evident they had conspired beforehand. If it weren't for his calm handling of the situation, and Nani Bethany finally breaking down to reveal the truth, he might have truly suspected his wife.
"Mother, please sit down first."
George Bennet helped the old madam to the grand armchair that the servants had just brought over, then turned and asked,
"You're saying you destroyed that handkerchief?" "Master, I was afraid that using it once or twice wouldn't achieve Mrs. Chambers' purpose, so I carefully hid it. If the second young master hadn't fallen ill, I would have let him use it a few more times. I didn't expect that after only one use, the second young master would already be infected."
The old madam, hearing this, felt something was amiss. Why was Mrs. Chambers being mentioned?
"Humph! Where did you hide it?" "Master, I placed the handkerchief in a small box and hid it under the bed, covering it with several pairs of shoes."
George Bennet glanced at the butler. Understanding the signal, the butler immediately turned and led some servants out. Before long, they returned carrying a small box.
"Open it!"
By now, George Bennet had pieced everything together. His gaze swept over his mother's slightly pale face, and a sense of dissatisfaction began to rise in his heart. He believed it was clear that his mother had colluded with the concubine to frame his wife. This thought, once planted, quickly took root and spread like wildfire in his mind.
"Master, this is indeed the handkerchief that the second young miss often uses."
A few maids stepped forward to inspect, then bowed and reported. At this point, the old madam finally understood. So, Mrs. Chambers had someone take Clara Bennet's belongings and give them to William Bennet? What was she trying to do? Harm her son, and then frame Amelia Peterson? This foolish woman, with such reckless and malicious schemes, could actually come up with this? Hearing this, George Bennet took a deep breath. With hands clasped behind his back, his tall figure stood in the silent courtyard, suddenly overwhelmed by an indescribable sorrow. George Bennet's expression was complex, grief, worry, anger, and pity all intertwined. In the end, George Bennet instructed the butler,
"Confine Mrs. Chambers to the winter garden. Without my permission, she's not allowed to leave. Additionally, have her copy Buddhist scriptures for 2 hours daily under supervision." "Yes, master." "Wait a moment."
George Bennet called out to the butler, who had just turned around. The matriarch's heart skipped a beat. Could there still be a twist to this matter? However, after hearing what George Bennet had to say, the matriarch was so furious she nearly fainted. Chapter 17, Demoted to a Concubine.
"Didn't the old master say before that Mrs. Chambers is nothing more than a concubine? From today onward, Susan Chambers will only be a concubine in this household. All her expenses will follow the standards of a concubine. Furthermore, remove the 2 servants from her courtyard as well." "Understood, sir."
The butler responded, and cautiously observed the matriarch's expression. The master's orders clearly intended to leave Mrs. Chambers to fend for herself. This time, it seemed the master had no regard for the matriarch's feelings at all. Although the matriarch was enraged, the situation was clear. What more could she say? She couldn't possibly ask her son to punish a daughter-in-law who hadn't committed any offense, could she? However, being experienced and sharp, the matriarch couldn't shake the feeling that someone was deliberately targeting Susan Chambers. After visiting William Bennet, who was still feverish, the matriarch gradually calmed down. Upon reflection, since William Bennet was currently being cared for by Amelia Peterson, it was unlikely Amelia Peterson would harm him. Wouldn't that be tarnishing her own reputation? But if Susan Chambers were accused of harming her own son, the matriarch felt something was off. After all, she was his biological mother. How could she be so cruel? Yet within the Bennet residence, there were only a handful of people. If it wasn't Mrs. Chambers, then who could it be? Moreover, this incident clearly targeted Amelia Peterson. If George Bennet hadn't trusted Amelia Peterson and pursued the matter thoroughly, it would likely have been Amelia Peterson who suffered misfortune by now. In Moonlit Terrace, Eleanor Bennet was smiling as she leisurely savored grapes. These were special grapes brought by Jack Russell from the Russell residence just for her. After eating a few, Eleanor Bennet seemed to lose interest. She instructed her servant to bring water for her to wash her hands, then reclined wearily on the Luan bed in the outer room.
"Miss, news has just arrived from Silkwood Court."
Nanny Victoria entered with a delighted expression and reported. In truth, Eleanor Bennet didn't need to hear it to know. Just by looking at Nanny Victoria's expression, she could already guess that the matter at Silkwood Court had succeeded. Mrs. Chambers would likely never rise again in this lifetime. Indeed, after hearing Nanny Victoria's report, Eleanor Bennet nodded, though her expression didn't share the same joy as Nanny Victoria's.
"Now that Mrs. Chambers is gone, who will take care of my second sister?"
Nanny Victoria paused, raising her head to look into the young lady's bright, sparkling eyes. Those eyes held a lively glimmer, and despite her young age, she exuded an air of nobility that left others in awe. Nanny Victoria was startled and quickly lowered her head. Just now, it seemed she had caught a glimpse of a cold gleam in the young lady's eyes. But how could that be? The young lady was only 10 years old and had always been raised in the inner chambers. How could she have such a chilling gaze? Nanny Victoria shook her head. Perhaps she was just too tired from rushing over and her vision blurred, making her see things incorrectly. Eleanor Bennet paid no attention to what Nanny Victoria might have seen or was thinking about. She casually asked,
"Is second sister still feverish?" "Yes, Mississippi." "That's correct. I heard that second Mrs. Measles haven't fully broken out yet, which has made the servants attending to her very worried."
Eleanor Bennet nodded.
That is indeed concerning. Now that Mrs. Chambers is confined, Nanny Victoria, why don't you take care of second sister for a few days? This time, little Nanny Bethany made a mistake, and I fear her elder sister, Nanny Bethany, will also be implicated. Second sister can't go without someone trustworthy by her side." "Yes, miss, I understand."
As Eleanor Bennet extended her hand, Linda Young, standing beside her, quickly handed over a small box.
"Second sister's handkerchiefs can't be used anymore. Just use these for now. The fabric is of the finest quality. She had asked me for some before, but I was reluctant to give them. Now that she's ill, let her use these temporarily. Remember, she's suffering from measles, so her handkerchiefs need to be changed daily." "Yes, Mississippi. I will remember,"
Nanny Victoria replied as she accepted the box from Linda Young's hands. After bowing respectfully, she headed straight to Clara Bennet's quarters.
"Miss, why are second Mrs. Measles taking so long to break out? Shouldn't they have fully appeared by now? Could it be—"
Linda Young hesitated, unable to finish her sentence.
"Could it be what?"
Eleanor Bennet asked with a smile, as though she hadn't noticed anything amiss.
"Miss, I've heard that if measles don't fully break out and remain suppressed, it could become life-threatening."
Seeing Linda Young's worried expression, Eleanor Bennet smiled faintly.
"I didn't know you cared so much about your second sister."
Linda Young hesitated before replying.
"Miss, what are you saying? I just find second Mrs. symptoms a bit unusual. You don't know, miss, but I've heard the older maids in the house say that if measles stay suppressed for 4 or 5 days without breaking out, it could be very serious. Don't worry. Nanny Victoria is there to take care of her. Second sister's measles will break out soon enough."
Eleanor Bennet slightly tilted her head, her eyes flashing with a cold and resentful glint, her entire demeanor suddenly shifting. Since Eleanor Bennet had turned away, Linda Young didn't notice the change in her mistress's expression. Still worried, she continued,
"Actually, second miss often causes trouble. Back when she was with you, Wasn't she always one way in front of you and another behind your back?
No one in Moonlit Terrace likes second miss. So, are you saying that because second sister has measles, you feel satisfied?
Eleanor Bennet asked. Linda Young's face turned red, then pale, as she stammered.
Miss, I know it's wrong to think that way. It's terrible of me. But I can't help it. Miss, I know I was wrong. Please don't send me away.
Noticing Eleanor Bennet's face momentarily turn cold, Linda Young became frightened and knelt to the ground, her face pale as she feared being dismissed by her mistress.
How could that be? Get up. Do you know why Clara Bennett's measles haven't broken out yet? It's because she doesn't actually have measles. It's just a rash that resembles measles and frightens everyone, but it's entirely different. As for the fever, it's even easier to fake.
What?
Fake? Miss, do you mean that second miss is pretending to have measles?
Linda Young exclaimed. Eleanor Bennet glanced at her.
What do you think? This was clearly Mrs. Chambers' scheme. Taking this opportunity first, to get rid of her confinement, and second, only by going out could she find a way to deal with Mother.
Linda Young was stunned upon hearing this, but roughly understood the lady's meaning. Thinking carefully, it was indeed true. If it were truly measles, the rash would have appeared by now. Yet, the second lady had gone 4 or 5 days without any signs of a rash. Wasn't that extremely suspicious? Moreover, over the past few days, whenever she encountered the maids from the second lady's courtyard, none of them seemed worried as if death were near. Didn't this prove that the second lady's illness wasn't as severe as it seemed? Chapter 18. A Heartfelt Moment. In the afternoon, the warm sunlight and a gentle breeze lightly stirred Eleanor Bennet's side locks. Eleanor Bennet and Linda Young walked one behind the other, entering Silkwood Court.
Greetings to the eldest lady. Rise. Is Mother inside? Yes, eldest lady. Madam is inside taking care of the second young master.
Eleanor Bennet nodded, motioning for someone to lift the curtain as she stepped into the room.
Greetings, Mother. Eleanor, you're here. Come, sit down. Luckily, you've already had measles. Otherwise, I wouldn't have let you come here. Don't worry, Mother. Brother Jack said my body is fine now, and I've even learned from him some methods to alleviate discomfort caused by measles.
Eleanor Bennet spoke while signaling Linda Young to set down the tray she was holding, then took out a delicate porcelain bowl.
Mother, you must be tired. Please rest for a while. I'll take care of things here.
Seeing Eleanor Bennet's caring gaze, Amelia Peterson felt deeply comforted and nodded. She had indeed been exhausted from caring for her son these past few days. William Bennet lay on the bed, his small face covered with red measles spots. His entire body was wrapped in a blanket, leaving only his small head exposed.
Sorry to trouble you, elder sister,
William Bennet said weakly, his voice revealing his fatigue. Eleanor Bennet sat down on the chair beside the bed, signaling Linda Young to help William Bennet sit up before covering him again with a light blanket.
Here, this is a bowl of medicinal soup to make you feel better. I made it myself. You must drink it all, not leaving a single drop, okay?
Eleanor Bennet's voice was as gentle as water, causing William Bennet's once dim eyes to suddenly sparkle. It was as if he had been confined in darkness before, and Eleanor Bennet's presence was like a luminous pearl illuminating the dim room, stirring his heart. Eleanor Bennet also noticed that William Bennet had been acting a bit unusual these past few days. After asking their mother, she learned that the mastermind behind everything had been revealed to be Susan Chambers, and William had overheard this, leading to his gloomy mood. In Eleanor Bennet's heart, she felt a sense of joy. Initially, she had been thinking of ways to provoke William Bennet into realizing how shameless and despicable his biological mother was. Now, this opportunity had been handed to her by fate.
William, you're such a good boy. Tomorrow, I'll cook for you again, all right?
William Bennett nodded.
Yes. Thank you, elder sister. Come on, lie down. Your measles have already flared up, and in 2 more days, you should be fully recovered. By then, we can go to school together and catch crickets, okay?
William Bennett's eyes reddened, tears welling up at the corners.
Sister, why hasn't stepmother come to visit me?
Eleanor Bennett paused while tucking the blanket around her younger brother. It seemed the boy still held a glimmer of hope for Mrs. Chambers. TSK, such a stubborn child.
Stepmother is busy taking care of our younger sister, of course. She doesn't have time to check on you. Don't worry. Once you're better, we'll visit her together. Clara is also dealing with a rash right now.
Intentionally bringing up Clara Bennett again, Eleanor noticed a
fleeting shadow of gloom in William's eyes. Kids are so easy to influence. Just a little suggestion does wonders. Eleanor said no more, picking up the embroidery set she had left there yesterday and resuming her work. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a shimmering glow on her figure, serene, noble, and tranquil. In this moment, Eleanor Bennett was at her most beautiful, at least in William Bennett's eyes. The boy lay on the bed quietly, watching his sister embroider, occasionally smiling at him. This gentle, fairy-like young woman was his sister. William Bennett didn't know why, but simply thinking about having such a sister filled his heart with joy and contentment. He even felt prouder to have her than anything else in the world. Eleanor stayed by William's side until he fell into a deep sleep. Only then did she set her embroidery aside and quietly leave the room. Entering the main chamber, she saw her mother already resting on the bed. A warm smile curved her lips. She instructed a servant to place a chair in the hallway and sat there, silently enjoying the peaceful moment. About an hour later, Nanny Victoria hurried over.
Greetings, First Mississippi. Nanny Victoria, you're here? How is it? Did the second miss drink the soup I sent over? Is she feeling any better?
Nanny Victoria hesitated a bit.
First miss, the second miss said you had ill intentions and refused to drink it. She even knocked the bowl over. Moreover, she cried and demanded that stepmother come to take care of her.
Eleanor Bennett frowned slightly.
Why would my sister think that of me? That soup was prepared in the main kitchen, the same as the portion for my younger brother. How could I have added anything harmful? My sister's thoughts are truly hard to fathom. Fine, I shouldn't meddle in others' affairs. Let her do as she pleases. But First Miss, the second miss is still suffering from her rash, and if she keeps acting out like this, it might not heal properly. If scars remain, outsiders might put all the blame on Madam.
Eleanor looked a bit concerned and turned her gaze toward the eastern wing. William Bennett should be awake by now.
If that's the case, let's go. I'll come with you to persuade her. Mother has been working hard taking care of my younger brother alone. She doesn't have time for anything else. Yes, Mississippi.
Eleanor's prediction was correct. William Bennett was indeed awake. To be more precise, he woke up right after she left the room. Eleanor's presence gave him an inexplicable sense of security. As soon as she left, that feeling vanished, and his already light sleep naturally broke. Eleanor Bennett had just stepped into the courtyard when she saw 3 or 4 servant girls kneeling under the eaves. She frowned slightly.
What is going on here? First miss, the second miss said we served her poorly and punished us to kneel out here.
Eleanor Bennett wanted to pardon him, but thinking they were Clara Bennett's servant girls, she could only sigh.
All right, let me go and persuade second sister to calm down. You must be more careful in serving her in the future. Thank you, First Mississippi.
Eleanor Bennett nodded slightly and smiled as she walked into the room. Sometimes, to win people's hearts, there is no need to curry favor or manipulate. Simply letting them see the difference between you and others is enough. As Eleanor Bennett stepped into the room, Clara Bennett immediately grabbed a teacup and hurled it at her. Eleanor Bennett stepped back half a step, and the teacup shattered less than a foot away from her feet, staining her dress with tea and tea leaves. Chapter 19. The Sisters Act. Eleanor Bennett glanced down at her dress, but seemed unbothered. Instead, she looked up with great interest at Clara Bennett sitting on the bed. The mocking look in her eyes was blatant, making Clara Bennett shiver involuntarily, as if she were being put on display for sale, her whole body uncomfortable. To conceal the panic in her heart, Clara Bennett shouted loudly,
"Why are you here? Get out! I don't need your fake kindness."
The smile on Eleanor Bennett's lips did not fade. She gracefully stepped over the broken shards and approached Clara Bennett.
"Second sister, you're breaking out in a rash. If you don't want scars, ruin your looks, and affect your future marriage prospects, it's best to listen to me and rest properly." "You?"
Clara Bennett, hearing her words and seeing the mockery in her eyes, immediately knew that the person before her had no good intentions.
"Eleanor Bennett, leave. I don't want to see you. If it weren't for you, Mother wouldn't have been taken away by Father. I wouldn't have broken out in a rash either. Second sister, watch your words. How could a rash like this possibly be faked?"
Eleanor Bennett tilted her head slightly, deliberately emphasizing the word faked, making Clara Bennett's spine go cold. That's right. Why had she carelessly said something like that? If someone with ulterior motives overheard, the ones in trouble wouldn't just be Mother, but herself as well. Clara Bennett quickly looked up, glaring fiercely at the older maids and servant girls in the room.
"All of you, get out! Stand guard at the door. I want to speak with my sister alone, and no one is allowed to enter." "Yes, Second Mississippi."
The oldest maid didn't miss the signal in her mistress's eyes. Eleanor Bennett's eyes flickered slightly. What now? Can't hold it in any more?
"Second sister, is there something important you want to tell me?"
Eleanor Bennett's smile remained warm and gentle, making others feel like leaning on her. Unfortunately, in Clara Bennett's eyes, that smile clearly mocked and looked down on her.
"Elder sister, earlier I was impolite. I hope you won't hold it against me."
"Oh, why the sudden change in attitude? Acting obedient now?" Eleanor Bennett didn't believe it for a second. Clara Bennett's scheming wasn't any less than Susan Chambers. It's just that she was still young, and what she had learned from Susan Chambers was likely not enough to make her truly deep and unpredictable.
"What are you saying, second sister? We are blood sisters. A few arguments are nothing to worry about. Since elder sister says so, I feel relieved. Don't worry, elder sister, I'll listen to you, rest well, and leave this room as soon as possible."
The words sounded sincere, but Eleanor Bennett felt as if she could hear the grinding of teeth. How amusing.
"Our elder sister has arrived, and none of you even invited her to sit down. Quickly, invite her to sit." "No need. I only came because Nanny Victoria said you weren't in good spirits, so I dropped by to console you. Now that you've thought things through, I won't stay long. I'll take my leave. Elder sister, please wait."
Eleanor Bennett could clearly sense the urgency in Clara Bennett's tone. It seemed she indeed had another plan in mind.
"Is there something else, second sister?" "Elder sister, I haven't been to school for the past few days. I wonder what the teacher has been teaching recently. Could you briefly tell me about it?" "Of course. Recently, Father invited a female teacher who has been lecturing on the Lady's Companion. Besides that, the teacher continues to teach the lyrical anthology, and we're already more than halfway through. You must recover quickly and return to school soon. Thank you for your concern, elder sister."
As Clara Bennett said this, a fleeting look of disdain appeared in her eyes. If it weren't for stalling for time, why would she lower herself to speak to her like this? Damn it, why is it taking so long? While Clara Bennett deliberately prolonged the conversation, Eleanor Bennett didn't rush to leave. On the contrary, she was curious to see what Clara Bennett was plotting. It was also a good chance to observe what kind of scheme this 9-year-old could come up with to harm her. Eleanor Bennett soon heard hurried footsteps outside. Moments later, Clara Bennett suddenly smiled, then with a loud thud, collapsed to the ground. Clearly, Clara Bennett had been smiling, but her words were filled with pain and sorrow.
Elder sister, I've ended up like this, yet why do you still treat me this way? What did I do wrong?
Eleanor Bennett hadn't even had the chance to say anything when the matriarch entered the room, immediately witnessing this bizarre scene. Eleanor stood frozen, staring at Clara Bennett lying on the ground, dressed only in her undergarments, her face filled with anguish as she looked up at her.
What is going on here? Oh, my child, do you want to break this old woman's heart? Why are you just standing there? Quickly, help the second young miss up. The girl is breaking out in a rash. Lying on the cold floor like this, what if she catches a chill?
Several people hurried over to lift Clara Bennett onto the bed. At that moment, she was sobbing uncontrollably, looking utterly pitiful. Once everything had been settled, the matriarch turned to Eleanor Bennett with a stern voice.
Eleanor, tell me, what is all this about?
The scene the matriarch had witnessed at the door was truly shocking. The granddaughter she adored so much had appeared before her in such a state. Thinking about Susan Chambers, who had just been demoted to a concubine, the matriarch's fury flared up fiercely, and her attitude toward Eleanor Bennett was no longer as kind as before. The corner of Eleanor Bennett's mouth curved up slightly. She couldn't deny it. Clara Bennett was indeed clever, knowing exactly how to exploit the matriarch rather than anyone else. Looking around the Bennett residence, it seemed only the matriarch would show her any favoritism or believe her words.
Grandmother, I truly don't know what happened. I had prepared 2 servings of medicinal soup in the kitchen to help those with measles break out in a rash more quickly. 1 for my second brother, and 1 for my second sister. But not only did my second sister refuse to drink it, she even
spilled it and accused me of trying to harm her. Grandmother, I've been so wronged.
Eleanor Bennett finished speaking, her face showing a look of grievance as she gazed at the matriarch. Feigning innocence and pity, who wouldn't know how to do that? However, Eleanor didn't expect the matriarch to fully believe her. She simply wanted to stir up trouble. Clara Bennett, you can call on the matriarch for support, but do you think I can't do the same? Don't assume you're the only one who's smart. This time, I'll make sure you face the consequences of your own actions. Chapter 20. Think carefully.
Sister, why would you say such a thing? When did I ever say that?
Clara Bennett froze, not expecting Eleanor Bennett to react so quickly. She immediately began crying and denying the accusations while still pretending to be frail.
Grandmother, I'm so tired. I have no strength left. Oh, grandmother. All right. Lie down and rest. Don't move anymore. Grandmother, since my second sister is breaking out in a rash, she really should rest. If you have anything to ask, please do so in the main hall. Let's not disturb her recovery. If the rash leaves scars, it will affect her for life.
Hearing this, the matriarch began to feel that Eleanor Bennett might not be the type to harm Clara Bennett after all. Reflecting on the past few days, Eleanor had been visiting William Bennett at Silkwood Court every day after school. This, the matriarch knew well. She also knew about Eleanor preparing 2 bowls of soup today. The matriarch nodded.
All right, let's go and let Clara rest and recover.
Clara Bennett couldn't believe that the old madam actually agreed with Eleanor Bennett. No way. If she leaves and I'm not here, who knows what Eleanor Bennett might say to slander me?
Grandmother, I'm feeling so unwell. Please don't go, grandmother.
The old madam, hearing her beloved granddaughter's sweet and pitiful voice, immediately softened.
All right, my dear, I won't go. I'll stay here with you, okay? All right. But grandmother, earlier sister.
Clara Bennett began to speak, her eyes already welling up with tears. This performance was truly impressive. Even Eleanor Bennett had to admire it. Were those tears always ready to fall at will? The old madam hesitated slightly, then noticed Eleanor Bennett biting her lip, as if she was holding back some grievance, but didn't want to voice it. Her gaze shifted downward and landed on the tea stains and scattered tea leaves on Eleanor Bennett's dress.
What happened here?
It's nothing.
Really, it's nothing.
Eleanor Bennett quickly shook her head, her eyes showing a hint of panic.
I just accidentally spilled some tea. It's no big deal.
Clara Bennett inwardly cursed. This was bad. She hadn't noticed earlier that Eleanor Bennett hadn't even wiped her dress. Claiming she spilled it herself? The more she said things like that, the less likely grandmother would believe her. Sure enough, the old madam's face darkened as she glanced toward the floor near the doorway, where there were still wet tea stains. If it had been an accidental spill, why was it near the door? There was no table or chair there. Why would a well-bred young lady like Eleanor Bennett be standing there holding a teacup? The old madam was sharp and discerning. Though Clara Bennett was clever, she was still young. After observing for a few moments, the old madam understood the situation. However, considering that Clara Bennett was her biological granddaughter, carrying the bloodline of the Chambers family, and currently without a mother to care for her, the old madam felt it was her duty to protect her. If she didn't, who would? Having made up her mind, the old madam's expression softened slightly.
Eleanor, you are the eldest daughter of the Bennett family. Looking like this, what sort of decorum is that? Go back and change immediately. If outsiders see you, won't they mock the Bennett family for not teaching their daughters proper manners? Yes, grandmother. I understand.
Though she said this, Eleanor Bennett had no intention of leaving. Just then, naughty Victoria came in to report.
Madam, the master has returned and requests your presence.
The old madam stood up immediately upon hearing this. After taking 2 steps, she seemed to hesitate and turned back to say,
Eleanor, you are the eldest sister. You must set an example for your younger siblings. If they make mistakes, teach them patiently. Don't let people say that the eldest daughter of the Bennett family is harsh and unkind to her siblings.
These words were clearly a blunt warning. Eleanor Bennett smiled faintly and curtsied to the old madam.
Yes, grandmother. I will remember your teachings.
After seeing the old madam off, Eleanor Bennett turned around and noticed Clara Bennett had already sat up, now looking at her with a smug expression. Eleanor Bennett suddenly couldn't understand Clara Bennett anymore. Was she truly intelligent or just foolish? Did she really think a
few words from the old madam could scare her? Moreover, did she genuinely believe that what had just happened put her in an advantageous position?
Humph. Grandmother favors me. If you want to tattle, someone has to be willing to listen. If you have the guts, go tell grandfather directly. Let's see if he'll believe you or me, a sickly person like you.
Hearing her words, Eleanor Bennett suddenly burst into laughter. Her laughter was clear and melodious, like the song of a nightingale, or the sound of a flute being played, enchanting to the ears.
Eleanor Bennett, what are you laughing at?
Clara Bennett asked through gritted teeth, her body tensing as she heard the laughter.
Oh! Has little sister now taken it upon herself to decide whether her elder sister can laugh or not?
Eleanor Bennett replied while stepping closer to the bed. Clara Bennett, realizing they were alone in the room and that she herself was utterly powerless at the moment, feared that Eleanor might actually harm her. She knew she wouldn't stand a chance. Thinking this, Clara shrank back on the bed, retreating until her back pressed against the wall.
Dear sister, do you know why, even though you weren't infected, you're now breaking out in rashes?
Eleanor asked, her tone calm yet chilling. Clara Bennett immediately grew wary, glaring at her and pointing with a trembling finger.
It's you? It's you, isn't it? I knew you didn't have good intentions. You're so cruel at such a young age. You won't die peacefully.
Die a restless death? The smile on Eleanor Bennet's lips gradually widened. She hadn't expected that Clara Bennett, who in her past life always feigned weakness and obedience in front of her, making her trust her completely and die with regrets, would dare to curse her so openly in this life. A hint of wetness flickered in Eleanor Bennett's eyes.
Whether I die peacefully or not is none of your concern, dear sister. Perhaps you should worry about yourself first. Breaking out in rashes all over and still causing trouble time and again. Are you trying to harm yourself?
Clara Bennett's face fell as she heard this.